The story begins with a young blonde man who seemed to know that name very well. A master swordsman is seen furious and shattered mirror fragments locked inside his room. He holds a weapon in one hand and a flower in the other, showing he is on the verge of madness. That was the useless eldest son of Count Pertium, a young man who abandoned his talent to live confined in a room. Now the greatest knight of the north was being defeated by human trash. While kneeling before his enemy nearly surrendered, he hears that a lot of money had been spent on a trap. The man questioning this was someone dressed in armor with a weapon resting on his shoulder. That man with a sarcastic gaze looked down and asked if the man before him had enjoyed it. Meanwhile, the furious blonde man shouted, calling Ghislaine a piece of human garbage. The armored man, after confirming his identity, revealed there was more to it. He also claimed to know everything about the armies, and about how much they had lost and who the spies were that were constantly aided by reinforcements. Their entire plan had been completely dismantled, just like a Russian nesting doll with many layers. Lord Ghislaine's blue gaze expanded toward the already defeated man. The man shouted while showing signs of serious wounds caused by the battle. He screamed, unable to believe he had been just an ace up the enemy's sleeve, refusing to accept his defeat. And to silence the enemy, Lord Ghislaine pressed his foot on the man's face, intending to silence him forever. From above, he looked down after kicking him away with force. After everything, he threw his own mask on the ground, saying they could try to invade his lands as many times as they'd wanted. Then he declared there was a reason. He knew all the plans, and now the young Lord Ghislaine was revealed. All of this had happened 1 year ago in the kingdom of Lutania, near the Pertium estate. With that, the protagonist woke up trembling in a bed, looking at his hands, confused about what was happening. He reached for his neck and realized it was still intact, confirming he was alive, even though he knew it was impossible, as just moments ago he had been in a fierce battle. In a battlefield where many swords were seen on the ground, he fought against someone as strong as him. Even so, his face bore old scars and fresh wounds. He had been brutally beaten by his rival, and his body already showed it had reached its limit. After 2 heavy strikes, he crouched down while the red-haired man asked if he wasn't the king of mercenaries, one of the 7 strongest on the continent. That red-haired man, who asked if the war was over, was also one of the continent's strongest, the noble knight Idun. With his sword pointed at the defeated one, he asked if he had any last words, and the protagonist said his goal was to fulfill his revenge. He looked with hatred and disdain, wishing that damned redhead would die too, and so would end the king of mercenaries. The protagonist's opponent thought he was arrogant even in his final moments on Earth. Still pointing that sword, he said the protagonist had abandoned his family after his sister's death. At that moment, the protagonist glared at him with fury and asked how he could possibly know that, since he was from a different kingdom. The man said he shouldn't talk, but went on to confess that he had worked behind the scenes for a long time to find him. With a smile on his face, that redhead said they were workers of House Delphine and had done it all to destroy his family. The protagonist lowered his head, unable to say a word in response to the word we. He realized there had been a conspiracy behind the house of Duke Delphine, and only now, in his final moments, he discovered the truth. That red-haired man, looking down from above, said there was no reason to explain. He was going to die anyway. With wide eyes, the protagonist shouted that he would never forgive that bastard. It was clear in the redhead's eyes that he didn't care about carrying his enemy's hatred. And to finish it all, he separated the protagonist's head from his body with that massive sword. Now the protagonist looked at his reflection in a barrel of water and realized he was still whole. He touched his face and thought it had all been a hallucination, but noticed he looked younger than usual. Now looking around, he wondered if he had been taken hostage or used as a lab rat. But those thoughts vanished when someone called out to him, shouting, "Young master." Ricardo, a Pertium soldier, entered the tent to check if the young master was already awake. He is caught off guard by a sword that suddenly appears, held by someone standing behind him. Acting like a madman, the protagonist claimed he would let the man live without answering his questions, but he also said it wasn't guaranteed he might change his mind. The soldier couldn't understand what the young master was doing at that moment. Then Ricardo asked if he didn't think he was overstepping, that he could have simply said he didn't want to follow him. The blonde youth holding the sword observed that the man's reaction was strange, so he wanted to know more. Regardless, Ricardo quickly walked away, and while he had the chance, asked if he would keep throwing tantrums. Grabbing him by the neck, Ricardo asked if he had forgotten everything he did after taking his little nap. The protagonist found it strange to hear that he had thrown a tantrum and also refused to lead a group in the orc attack. He got upset and said he never threw tantrums. That was nonsense, but Ricardo insisted he had. The protagonist listened as the man said he would take his things and that they were heading somewhere. Ricardo, clearly upset, said they were returning to the Pertium estate. Things made less and less sense to the protagonist, who now looked at the man out of the corner of his eye. Tense but angry, he grabbed Ricardo's shoulder and asked him to repeat it. He wanted to know if the man was talking about the ruins of what once remained. However, when he finally arrived at the place, he saw the castle and the simple houses just as they had been before. He realized that everything was indeed there, and the estate was not reduced to ashes as it once had been. Ricardo came closer and whispered that calling it a ruin was a bit strange now. The protagonist had to make sure he wasn't dreaming, so he pulled at his cheeks to check. After pulling hard and feeling the pain, he realized it wasn't a dream, and Ricardo made a strange expression. Once again, fragments like broken mirrors returned to his memory. Now the region was whole. It was as if everything had gone back in time, and he had another chance to make things right. He knew that when he was younger, he had deep resentment toward his family and was very immature. He constantly threw tantrums because he felt inferior, and that led to problems. People began to avoid him. Unable to handle criticism, he ran away from home. Many years later, he became a mercenary, survived countless battles, and improved his skills. He made a name for himself, returned to the county to fix the mistakes of the past, but his home had been crushed. All he found were traces of destruction, fire, and a torn flag. Looking at the flag now, everything was as it should have been in the past. Everyone he loved was still there. He felt satisfied and couldn't believe his luck, so much so that he wanted to sing a song of joy. But it was too soon to celebrate. He looked at Ricardo and remembered that he had said something about orcs. He couldn't forget that day. It was the day when most of the squad would die. Everything would become a scene of horror where all or most of them would perish. In his past life, he had followed the orc attack squad, and in a desperate attempt to make a name for himself, the report had said there were only 3 orcs. But when they got there, there were more than 20 orcs, and almost everyone ended up dying because he had been too stubborn. Now he had a chance to win, since those orcs had no strategy. He believed the main issue now was earning everyone's trust, since at the moment he was seen as useless. Then he noticed something flying toward him. It was a piece of a wooden watchtower that had been launched. With that, the soldiers began shouting in a panic that the orcs had arrived, and as soon as they arrived, they began attacking the soldiers, who were all stunned. The protagonist also thought it was too early. He believed they were supposed to arrive a bit later, according to his past life. Everything turned into a massive battlefield, where most of the soldiers were being overwhelmed. A sharp voice shouted that they needed to form ranks. The man running at high speed was the commander of the attack squad, Chauvin. Even he realized the situation was out of control. There wasn't much anyone could do. When they looked at the terrain, they noticed that they had let their guard down and were ambushed when they least expected it, and there were many of those orcs. Suddenly, he was startled and looked to the side because someone was shouting, trying to get his attention. A huge orc was about to attack him when someone shouted at him to pay attention. From a distance, the protagonist saw that the orc was about to strike, so he rushed toward it so fast he was nearly invisible. When he approached, he placed a hand on the commander's shoulder, who was startled to see the young man and the orc. The protagonist threw the commander backward and leaped in front of the orc. Falling back, the old commander, still in shock, couldn't understand the reason behind such a sudden action. Standing still and watching the fight unfold before his eyes, he noticed that the young master was acting strangely. Right from the first strike, he managed to ensure that he would catch the orc's attention, which would create an opening. That was how he severed one of the orc's limbs, causing it to scream in pain. The old commander was left speechless by the scene. So were the guards, who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The orc stood in front of them with one limb missing and screaming. Then it fell, due to a few more strikes delivered by the protagonist. Handling the sword, he said he still couldn't use mana, and that he wished he had returned further into the past. Walking toward the man, he asked if he was the commander, while the man nodded. Showing his open hand in the commander's direction, he demanded that he hand something over. The man, looking at the young man, didn't understand what he wanted, finding his behavior strange. Without hesitation, the young lord declared he wanted the commander's right. That commander observed the protagonist carefully and even broke into a sweat as he realized the young man's sheer naivety. He clearly knew the young man was inexperienced, but risking everyone's life was unacceptable. So he simply stood up, calmly saying he couldn't allow that act to take place. Curious and slightly annoyed, he remarked that life shouldn't be treated like a game. Meanwhile, the protagonist just watched the commander walk away, finding his attitude extremely irritating and uncomfortable. At that exact moment, another orc appeared, ready to ruthlessly crush the experienced old commander. The commander's first reaction was to order the young man to retreat immediately, as he would handle everything. However, the young man raised his sword, stating that he hadn't received any acceptable alternative. Then he hurled his sword in a straight line, forcing the commander to dodge to avoid being struck. Overcome with intense rage, the commander grabbed the young man by the collar, demanding an explanation for such behavior. While yelling furiously, furrowing his brows, he suddenly realized that something strange and unexpected had just happened. He quickly turned his gaze to the side where the orc stood and was completely stunned. He could clearly see the precision of the sword embedded in the center of the skull. The scene showed without a doubt that the young man possessed vast skill in swordsmanship. Within seconds, the massive orc collapsed to the ground, leaving the commander utterly surprised. He wondered to himself how that foolish and noble, the Count's son, had accomplished something so absurd. Immediately, the protagonist asked the commander if he knew what was most important in a battle. Meanwhile, elsewhere, soldiers were trembling with fear, surrounded and completely defenseless before the cruel massacre. On the other side, the orcs displayed total superiority, mercilessly humiliating each of the desperate soldiers. The remaining fighters were mentally broken, with no physical, moral, or strategic support left on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed young man spoke about the motivation and determination that were necessary. He then resolved to act, pulling his sword from the skull of the defeated orc. He rushed onto the battlefield, displaying absolutely impressive skill and agility in that brutal setting. He positioned himself courageously between the orcs and the soldiers, demonstrating his full leadership capability. His stance not only surprised the watching soldiers but also left the commander completely stunned. Without hesitation, he pulled the sword from a nearby orc and invited the others to join the fight. With a sharp and cutting voice, he declared that he would eliminate them all as he had done with that one. Sensing his overwhelming aura, the remaining orcs began shouting furiously, trying to intimidate him by any means. They all sought to attack the young blonde man together, desperately hoping to stop his offensive. Yet the protagonist continued to surprise the commander, who was completely speechless at witnessing such extraordinary feats. The commander watched in disbelief as the slender young man performed maneuvers that even mana users couldn't replicate. However, even from a distance, he could clearly tell that the boy with the sword was extremely exhausted. Still, he admired how the young man used minimal movements to dodge the attacks he received. He also noticed that his fencing technique, focused on weak points, was precise. That slim and agile young master behaved exactly like a swordsman, even though he wasn't using mana. With wide eyes and filled with awe, the commander wondered if humans could achieve something even greater. Meanwhile, the protagonist shouted provocations at the enemies, asking if that was all they had. Easily dodging every strike, he mocked them, saying they didn't live up to the reputation of a warrior race. With that, all the soldiers realized that the young master was drawing all the orcs toward himself. The other soldiers shouted in desperation, begging the commander to take action and give orders for the situation. However, the commander was completely stunned, unable to understand what exactly that young master was doing. Then the protagonist sprinted toward a group of orcs, drawing all their attention. He had no intention of running away, as that direction led to the castle and the cliff. In that moment, the commander finally realized the brilliance of the plan, to lure the orcs to the edge of the cliff. He immediately turned pale, mouth and eyes wide open, unable to believe the young man would attempt something so extreme. He urgently ordered the troops to raise a shield wall as quickly as possible. He also announced that they would immediately follow the firstborn son, making it clear he was referring to the protagonist. Meanwhile, the young man kept running, followed by a group of heavily armed and dangerous orcs. Running with determination, he remained confident that the commander had understood his plan. At the same time, he tried to keep all the orcs close to the edge of the treacherous cliff. He recognized that his stamina was nearly depleted, so he needed to win using strategy alone. As more orcs arrived and tried to group up, their communication became increasingly chaotic, until one of the orcs noticed something strange happening right behind them. When they looked back, they saw the commander and several soldiers positioned with spears and shields. The protagonist also saw exactly what was going on, and a smile quickly appeared on his face. With that, the protagonist leaped backward, leaving the orcs to face the soldiers and the commander. As he fell from the cliff, he thought that from now on, it was up to the commander to handle everything. The commander, on the other hand, shouted desperately for the troops to execute the standard procedure previously established. The troops then easily surrounded the orcs, taking advantage of how close they were to the cliff's edge. The commander was the first to push with his shield and pierce with his spear. Soon all the soldiers followed his lead, pushing the orcs directly toward the cliff without hesitation. One by one, the orcs began to fall like ripe fruit dropping from an old tree. Although completely exhausted, the soldiers celebrated their victory for having eliminated all the enemy orcs. The commander then ran to the edge of the cliff, frantically shouting for the fallen young master. That was when he spotted the young man clinging to the hilt of a sword stuck near the cliffside. The look in the young man's eyes conveyed an overwhelming confidence, comparable to someone with incredible skill. From above, the commander saw that gaze carried a very specific and profound meaning. So a faint and hesitant smile appeared spontaneously on the hardened face of the old commander. He immediately began to stretch out his body, offering his arm and hand to help him up quickly. But it was almost too late. The young man's weak hands were slipping from the sword hilt. In a tragic instant, he fell, something neither the commander nor the protagonist wanted to witness. Watching the young master slowly fall, the commander was terrified and froze at that critical moment. As he fell, he heard someone calling his name. It was a sweet, familiar, and known voice. When he looked toward the apparition, he was surprised to see Helina, his younger sister. In the fragments of memory, she appeared curled up, trembling and crying, deeply feeling his absence. She also tenderly thanked her brother, acknowledging that he had always tried to be by her side. In other memories, she sobbed, innocently asking what she had done wrong to suffer so much. There were also memories of her turning away, saying he was a bad person. All those painful memories clearly brought forth the image of Helina, his little sister who had passed away some time ago. With fragments of something like mirrors in his hands, he realized they were precious memories of Helina. That's when something pulled his arm strongly, while a childlike voice called him brother. It was his sweet and gentle sister, still a child, holding his hand and begging him to come with her. Slowly he opened his eyes and found himself in a completely unfamiliar place. Not understanding exactly where he was immediately startled to see that simple, strange room he didn't recognize from recent memories. Looking at his hands, he reflected that if he was still alive, he must have miraculously survived. For a brief moment, he thought maybe it had all been a dream or just a delusion. However, the intense pain spread throughout his entire body proved that it had all been real. Holding his abdomen, he felt that every muscle and bone in his body was aching to their absolute limit. Then someone opened the door, surprised to see him awake, despite clearly being in pain. The girl with white, slightly pinkish hair smiled, amused that the master was already awake. Looking more closely at the female figure, he immediately recognized from her appearance that it was Belinda. He thought he should tell her everything right away, as the truth could no longer be hidden. He then revealed that he had died a few times, and somehow had now returned to life. The girl was surprised and laughing a lot, seemed to find that revelation completely absurd and extremely amusing. While fixing the bedsheet, she commented that he really seemed to have been through a lot. Right after, she became extremely angry, giving him a harsh scolding because she thought he was lying. She also said he couldn't take such risks, because what if he couldn't make it? She was clearly referring to the festival, reminding him that, being so injured, he might end up missing the event. It was at that exact moment that he remembered the festival, realizing the date was approaching. With her arms crossed, she noticed that he had forgotten, then reminded him that Helina was eagerly waiting. Looking at a photograph on the desk, he heard Belinda say it was a great chance to get closer. He slowly approached the photograph, picked up the picture frame in his hands, and recalled the city's traditional annual festival. He clearly remembered how he used to lock himself in his room, avoiding past festivals and events. That's why, holding the picture frame tightly, he turned serious and asked how much time was left before it happened. She calmly replied that it was about a week away, while he remained silent, still with his back turned. He knew that would be exactly the day that had drastically changed his life forever. He then heard footsteps approaching, and someone asked if he was inside, knocking lightly on the door. Glancing sideways, he realized the painful memory of his sister still haunted him. In the memory, Helina, sweet and smiling, firmly held his arm, begging him to go with her. It was a memory impossible to forget, difficult to ignore, a past that insisted on staying present. He knew very well that exactly 1 week after that moment, his beloved little sister would tragically die. Now he simply watched that living memory, carrying in his heart the weight of that inevitable and cruel fate. Suddenly, he approached his sister and gave her a tight hug as if he hadn't seen her in years. That act even startled the maid, who had been calmly smiling at him before. Little Helina asked her brother what was going on, and if that was some kind of prank. As he placed a hand on her shoulder, he heard her say that she had missed him. Afraid, she pushed him so hard that he fell on top of the maid, saying she was scared of his behavior. Holding his chest, he thought she had a lot of strength for such a small child. With a serious face, she told her brother that she had stayed there because Belinda had asked her to, and she looked at him with a pout. Upset, she reminded him of the day he shouted at her to leave, saying she was revolting. Embarrassed, the protagonist touched his neck and felt shy, as he couldn't even remember having acted like that. When he apologized, it startled both the maid and the girl. When he heard his sister say he had taken a beating from the orcs, he quickly said that wasn't true. His whole body hurt, and it was hard for him to keep pretending. Soon the pain overwhelmed him. He crouched down, trembling with the intense pain, and his sister thought he hadn't defeated the orcs. He had to watch both the maid and his sister laughing hysterically at him, thinking he was just weak. Even though he was being mocked, he still felt satisfied because everyone was just like in his memories. He just didn't understand why his past self had done so many foolish things, like pushing his little sister away. How could anyone refuse to go to a festival with their sister, especially when that ended up being the last time he saw her alive? Later, he found only fragments of what she once was, along with her bodyguards who hadn't been able to protect her. That memory brought him a heavy conscience, and he believed he should have stayed by her side the entire time. Then someone knocked on the door asking if they could come in, and since no one was expecting it, everyone turned to the door. Some soldiers entered. They were Miss Alina's bodyguards. Then the little one asked the two of them if something had happened, since she had told them to wait outside. The protagonist heard the bodyguards asking if she could supervise their work, and he found it strange. So he asked Belinda why his sister of all people had to do that, and she explained that there were too few servants. He couldn't just watch little Alina leave with her two bodyguards, not when his past self hadn't known she was working. In fact, he didn't want her to go alone, and asked to be allowed to join her and help out. It all sounded strange, and she turned back and just stared at his face with a look of suspicion. Belinda also found it strange that he was volunteering to do something, and his sister thought the blow to the head might have been more serious. Even so, preparations for the festival had to proceed as usual. When all the servants saw that the young master was approaching, they began talking among themselves. She quickly jumped on her brother, asking him to stay quiet. He found his sister's sudden behavior odd. As she pushed his face with her hand, he remembered that the incident involving her happened far from the festival. To prevent it, he needed to know the entrances and exits of that castle before any further assessment. While the siblings were stuck in that standoff, his sister tried to stop him from helping someone and called out to him. When he looked, he realized it was someone familiar and searched his memory to figure out who it was. He soon recognized it was old Fergus, and the man looked exhausted from running around looking for news. The man looked at the young master to see if he was okay and wanted to know if he had really fought orcs. He told the man he had arrived just in time because his brother had been acting strangely. He was tired of being treated that way, but he needed to find out more about the castle. So he asked the man if there was any abandoned training ground in the castle and said he wanted to go there. He gave a casual greeting and asked why, saying he would begin his own training. Fergus watched the young master carefully and couldn't believe what he was hearing. Even so, he showed parts of the castle, and it seemed the two of them were heading somewhere. As soon as they arrived, the protagonist found it strange because he had no memory of that place. Upon entering, he felt it was perfect for training. He had never had so much privilege before. The equipment was excellent, and nothing like that had ever been available to him when he was just a mercenary. Fergus commended to the young master that he had left the place untouched in case he ever wanted to use it. The man looked at the young master and thought that, no matter what was happening, he would overcome it. A memory came to him, and he knew that in the past, that person had also trusted him. Now he finally understood what had happened, and placing his hand on the man's shoulder, he told him he should live a long life. The young man knew that this man was very intelligent and remembered him from his previous experience. He also recalled that the man hadn't believed in him in the past, but now he was saying goodbye, promising to stay by his side forever. Looking at that man, he didn't know why he had treated everyone like enemies in the past. Now calmer, he remembered the servant girl, his sister, and Fergus, and knew that they were all his friends. He knew he had 1 week to change the future and protect his sister's life. He remembered that, at the time, it had been revealed that one of the lords from a neighboring land was partly responsible for his sister's death, and it was because of that that the city was ravaged by war and eventually fell into ruin. Knowing that, the protagonist was certain that his sister's death had been the beginning of his family's downfall. Now he had the chance to fix everything, protect his sister, and prevent another war. But first he needed to improve his physical condition, and it saddened him that he didn't have much time. His first step was to control mana, so he began breathing properly. Sitting in the middle of that place, he believed that mana was a supernatural power that allowed humans to surpass their limits. He remembered meditating many times, even on battlefields and amid chaos. Now he had to concentrate, so he brought both hands together and began channeling mana. Someone like him, who had lived through thousands of battles, would have no trouble creating a mana core. His face was marked by many past attempts, and he appeared to be straining hard to manifest mana. He remembered learning everything from a burned magic book he had found years ago. He knew that the mana core was something natural to humans, and he had already managed to create 2. He believed he could create a second, and maybe even a third core, forming connections between them. And when he managed to do that, his expression changed completely. He seemed to be channeling an overwhelming force. He strained so hard to maintain the 3 cores that he ended up with a nosebleed. Because of that, he bent down slightly, falling out of the ideal posture, having reached his limit with 3 cores. It was a shame because, in the past, he had managed to reach 5 cores, which gave him explosive power. He remembered the battlefield and knew he had lost because he failed to expand the cores. Wiping his nose, he thought that he needed to refine that technique even without much time. He wasn't willing to let everything happen again as it did in the past life. He wouldn't let that bastard behind House Delphine, nor the accomplices who destroyed his country, get away with it. With that, the week flew by and the day of the festival had arrived. He was already getting ready with his belt and a few items he might need if he had to fight. He didn't even leave his sword behind because he didn't plan on being caught off guard. His sister noticed he looked surprised, and his eyes widened when he saw her there. She crossed her arms and murmured that she thought he wouldn't even go, and that he'd gone a bit crazy after that hammer blow to the head. Looking at him, she said he seemed different, and that she'd heard he'd been training alone. Somewhat embarrassed, he scratched his neck and said there was nothing strange about that, given how close he was to the line of succession. The protagonist was caught off guard when his sister reminded him that he always used to say their father was annoying. Still, she was smiling and seemed happy with how things were going. Sighing, she said it felt like her old brother had come back. Those words made the protagonist simply stare at the girl without saying anything. Even he felt that, in just 1 week, he had made several changes to the present that could affect the future. As the two walked, Belinda was advising the lady's bodyguards to keep their eyes on her at all times. The protagonist thought the flow of events would be similar and saw everything like a game of chess. He had good pieces, but he needed to be precise with every move. All of his preparations were already done, so he looked again at his belt. His sister was acting like a child, going from place to place without staying long at any of the stalls. She kept pulling her brother to the next spot because she wanted to try everything at the festival. The two were together, and the girl, sitting on the steps, said that nothing seemed different that year. The protagonist thought it was strange that, since the festival was almost over, nothing had happened yet. Someone approached her, and the protagonist heard the person say they wanted to show her other areas. The knight told the girl that some friends had new things set up in other parts of the festival. The excited girl left holding the knight's hand, saying it would be fun to see new things. Her brother and the protagonist kept his attention sharp, now certain that her bodyguards were involved. To him, it was clear that they were the traitors who had caused his sister's death in the previous life. And who would have thought that Helina's bodyguards, Jamal and Phillips, were the real traitors? The protagonist, watching closely, already knew that the story about them dying while protecting her was a lie. He stared at them with conviction, sure they were traitors to the kingdom, and that they couldn't be trusted. For that reason, he would never allow those two to be alone with Helina under any circumstances. When they arrived at a certain location, one of the bodyguards extended his arm and informed them they had arrived. He pointed to a completely deserted area. No stalls, no people, not even traces of the big festival. The girl looked extremely disappointed, gazing in all directions but seeing absolutely nothing different. She suspiciously questioned why that place looked so abandoned, filthy, empty, and without any sign of activity. With a forced smile, the bodyguard replied that some very interesting things would be arriving there soon. The protagonist stayed extremely alert, watching carefully as he had already perfectly understood their suspicious behavior. Even though that terrain seemed deserted at first glance, his mercenary experience revealed something entirely different. He knew that place hid obstacles and that all possible escape routes were blocked. Suddenly, his sister yanked his arm abruptly, giving him a massive and unexpected scare. Meanwhile, the bodyguard tried to convince the girl to stay, but she firmly refused. During that sudden tug, the brother asked if she had been doing any secret training lately. However, she was abruptly cut off when one of the bodyguards stepped in front, blocking everything. With a strange expression on his face, the man said they should wait just a little longer. Phillips was surprised to notice he was speaking in such an aggressive and disrespectful tone toward her. Watching everything, the protagonist clearly saw that both Jamal and Phillips were acting strangely. Jamal, scratching the back of his neck, said he didn't want to scare her, but that he had received certain orders. As he spoke, he smiled disturbingly, with an insane expression that would send chills down anyone's spine. The visibly frightened girl desperately asked what kind of order that was and who gave it. It didn't take long before the one responsible for that order finally appeared there, at that very spot. This mysterious person was accompanied by two others, one of them wearing a hat and a long coat. The man with the hat and long hair praised the bodyguards, saying they had done an excellent job. Jamal then approached the man and informed him that he had brought the young lady exactly as requested. However, the man was surprised to see the eldest son of Pertium accompanying the girl. He said, intrigued, that he didn't remember asking for that young man to be brought along as well. As he spoke, he watched the girl clinging tightly to her brother's arm, clearly seeking protection. Jamal then stated that he would personally take care of the boy, since he had naively followed them. The protagonist then questioned Jamal directly, asking if he really believed he would get away after betraying them. Jamal replied coldly, saying the boy should be much more worried about saving his own life. Meanwhile, a quick glimpse of the kingdom showed exhausted guards and other subordinates wanting to abandon that place. In his own thoughts, Jamal was sure there were hundreds of others willing to desert. Without wasting time, the protagonist threw Jamal to the ground with a precise strike before he could react. The traitor never expected to be attacked so suddenly, and was completely taken by surprise and quickly subdued. His sister and the other bodyguard, Phillips, were stunned by the action taken by the young man. Even that long-haired man in the hat realized the boy wasn't ordinary. After the strike, the protagonist declared that they would never have sold anyone, saying so with his back turned. He then turned around to face Phillips, revealing his fury and making it clear he would not hesitate again. Realizing the situation, Phillips reacted quickly, holding the girl tightly and trying to use her as a shield. However, the protagonist was a trained mercenary and immediately drew his sword and threw it. Phillips would never have believed he'd be hit in the forehead by a sword thrown from a distance. The young man then ran to his sister, using mana to carefully remove the blade embedded in the traitor. Meanwhile, the two men accompanying the man in the hat watched, finding the boy impressive. The man with the hat and glasses judged, based on appearances, that he was right. This was the young master. Analyzing the entire scene closely, he realized the boy was demonstrating surprising abilities using advanced mana techniques. Helina, completely terrified, clung to her brother and desperately asked what was happening there. He then struck her neck lightly, just enough to make her faint and not witness what would come next. With great care, he took his sister in his arms and laid her on the ground, shielding her from what was about to happen. The man in the hat, watching all this, thanked the boy for doing the job in their place. Approaching slowly, the man commented that the boy was quite different from what everyone had said. While calmly smoking his pipe, he asked if the boy had been hiding his true abilities all this time. The protagonist, gripping his sword firmly, asked directly what that man's interest was in his abilities. Handling the blade with precision, he reflected that he was facing 3 opponents and had to think fast. The 2 accompanying that man were not ordinary, they exuded an absurd amount of mana. The protagonist, already preparing his abilities, thought he needed to end this as quickly as possible. However, before beginning, he wanted to ask who exactly had ordered them to commit such an atrocity there. But upon hearing that, the man replied coldly that he refused to say anything. He made it clear that he had no intention of talking, as his plan was simply to eliminate the boy immediately. The protagonist wasn't shaken, but released a massive amount of mana, demanding answers mercilessly. One of the men asked the leader if he should kill him, but the leader said no. That man's true intention was to capture the boy alive, making him suffer greatly so he could grow stronger. Right after that, the 2 charged straight at him, clearly intending to kidnap him. The protagonist, however, had already foreseen this attack and had a clear, well-prepared plan. Without hesitation, he quickly pulled something from his belt, which had been strategically prepared for that moment. He threw the object at the 2 enemies, aiming precisely while staying completely alert. Seeing it, the man assumed it was just a firework meant to distract them. However, the object violently hit one of them in the face, shattering and releasing a thick smoke. When that man opened his eyes, he realized, too late, that the protagonist had already struck his forehead. The second tried to react to protect his comrade, but he too was caught, as the boy was alert. The attack was swift and precise, and the protagonist easily blocked the blow coming from behind. He watched every movement of that opponent closely, so he was able to react at the exact moment without exposing himself. He grabbed the man's arm, trapping his sword with his own blade, completely overpowering that desperate attempt. Thus, in a matter of seconds, the man was left without his sword, completely defenseless and about to fall. Showing no mercy, the protagonist swiftly ended the fight, relieving the opponent's suffering with a single blow. However, he quickly realized a greater danger was approaching. Someone was about to strike him brutally from behind. The attack came with full force, but it only hit the sword the protagonist held behind his back. That man was surprised, as he hadn't imagined the boy could block it even in such a disadvantageous position. He then realized that the protagonist's movement had been perfect, a stealthy block executed masterfully. Without wasting time, he advanced towards the boy, believing he could do what the others hadn't. With his 2 swords drawn, the protagonist managed to snatch the pipe from the man's mouth. In the following moments, the man tried to land a fatal blow, but the boy crouched, quickly dodging. Defending himself with mastery, the protagonist used his 2 swords to block fierce and incredibly fast attacks. Even so, he suffered a light cut on the neck, realizing that with little mana left, he would be dead in that instant. Still defending himself, he reflected on how this man had so much resistance, even after taking so many direct counterattacks. The enemy, staring at him, said he had no idea how the boy mastered such a strange fencing style. Smiling sinisterly, the man then declared, with conviction, that the boy wouldn't survive until dawn. And with that, the man advanced towards the protagonist, claiming that he would never lose. With an uncontrolled laugh, he made it clear that he would eliminate the boy that very day. The protagonist, however, also wore a smile on his face, showing that he was thoroughly enjoying himself. This made the man extremely nervous, as he clearly noticed the mocking smile on that confident face. Soon after, the protagonist made an unbelievably fast move, blending defense and attack in an impressive way. The movement was so fast that the man didn't even notice the steps performed flawlessly. Therefore, he quickly retreated, maintaining his distance while trying to think of his next move. Adjusting his hat and with broken glasses, he said that filthy mana didn't work. However, his conviction changed when he started coughing uncontrollably, realizing too late that he was seriously injured. The wound was so intense that his body began to weaken, bending over as he coughed incessantly. Looking at his trembling hand, he simply couldn't believe what he was witnessing. As the man writhed in pain on the ground, the protagonist walked calmly toward him. During the walk, he exuded a dense aura and a murderous intent impossible to ignore. Now that he knew who was behind it, he swore to make the man pay in full. With a chilling gaze, he coldly ordered the man to prepare himself, as he would release his third core. No matter how hard he tried to understand, the man couldn't believe that such a young boy could enhance his mana so much. With his two swords drawn, the protagonist advanced quickly, aiming directly for the head of the terrified enemy. The man's mocking smile disappeared completely, leaving only pure fear on his face. Even being skilled, the man could barely block the onslaught of attacks coming without any pause. The protagonist put the force of someone fighting as if it were his last day into every strike. The opponent was completely at a disadvantage, for the boy fought with a desire for revenge in his heart. The man, surprised, realized his hands began to tingle just from blocking the relentless attacks. He understood then that no matter how much mana he had, every human being had a well-defined limit. In fact, his own sword was beginning to show cracks, something he never imagined witnessing in his life. He had never heard of someone who could expand and control mana in such a way. Looking at the protagonist, he concluded that the boy had completely transformed into someone utterly different. In the next move, the protagonist finally managed to completely break the enemy's sword blade. He then realized it wasn't just the blade, he had also struck the man directly. The protagonist's gaze, filled with hatred, made it clear that he wouldn't stop after just one blow. Therefore, he delivered a few more cuts, determined to ensure that the man wouldn't survive in any way. Overcome by unbearable pain, the man opened his mouth, screaming and coughing desperately. The protagonist then struck his neck with his hand, determined to silence the man forever. Violently pushing the man against a wall, he declared that they would end that unfinished conversation right there. With brutal strength, he pressed the man against the wall, demanding to know who had sent him to do this. The man, named Sargasso, didn't plan on dying easily, so he drew a small blade hidden in his sleeve. He believed that even in this situation, he could finish the job by quickly throwing the dagger at the child. However, when he tried to throw it, he was surprised to find himself completely bound by dense threads of mana. The protagonist tightened his grip even further, simultaneously preventing any desperate attempts. He coldly ordered him not to try any more foolishness and to answer all his questions immediately. The man, perplexed, simply couldn't believe that children like this, mastering so much mana, could really exist in this world. He then remembered that at the beginning of the fight, the boy's energy had seemed practically insignificant and irrelevant. While thinking, he felt the protagonist tightening the sword embedded in his stomach more and more. Without getting any answers, the boy warned that if he insisted, he would destroy his mana core directly. It was at that moment that the man realized that boy was definitely not someone he could bargain with. The protagonist began to gather mana in a completely different way, which left the man terrified. Desperate, he screamed as he felt his own mana core begin to crack rapidly. It was as if a glass sphere was shattering, letting all of its contents leak out. Frightened, the man shouted that the boy was completely insane, as that could cause a massive explosion. The young man, staring into his eyes, replied that dying was for the weak, and he knew exactly what he was doing. The man, experienced enough, immediately understood that the boy wasn't bluffing in a single word he had said. When he looked into the young master's eyes, he felt for the first time the true taste of fear. In desperation, he screamed that it had all been ordered directly by that damned Count Desmond. Trembling, he confirmed that it was indeed the Count who had hired him to provoke a war in that territory. The protagonist looked at the man, concluding that everything that had happened was that damned Count's fault. He remembered that, in his past life, situations like this only happened to those who challenged the Duchess's house. Tightening his grip around the man's neck, he declared that it now made sense they had tried to kill his sister. Naturally, as expected, once the man opened his mouth, the protagonist took care of finishing him off. Terrified, the man asked why he was doing this if he had promised to let him live. However, the protagonist replied that, just like him, he also knew how to lie very well when he wanted to. As the man began to laugh strangely, the protagonist sensed that something was very off. Getting closer, with their foreheads touching, the man said his job was already done. He also stated that no one would ever believe the words of a mere mercenary without any real credibility. However, the protagonist ignored everything, gripped his head tightly, and said he would share a little secret. He claimed that he had died and been reborn in that body, and this time, everything would be completely different and fair. Right after, he exploded the man's mana core directly, causing an absolutely devastating blast. The explosion was so intense it could be seen from miles away, lighting up the sky with pink light. As the fragments rose like fireworks, that dangerous element had finally been completely eliminated, just like the other two fools who had dared to touch the protagonist's sister. Their bodies still lay there, sprawled on the ground, defeated with no chance for reaction or mercy. The protagonist looked in all directions, carefully evaluating everything that had just happened. His gaze then turned to his sister, who still lay on the ground, asleep. Tired and exhausted, he let his swords fall to the floor, for he no longer had the strength to hold them. Soon after, he fell to his knees as extreme fatigue was beginning to take over his entire body. A few seconds later, his body began to react, feeling intense pain and nearly unbearable exhaustion. In a matter of seconds, he was completely collapsed, coughing uncontrollably and feeling excruciating pain throughout his body. He thought with irony that exploding 3 mana cores didn't seem so serious back when he was a mercenary. However, he knew he couldn't stay there, as he urgently needed to find a place to hide. Looking around, he noticed a door leading somewhere and quickly followed it. Kicking the door open, he saw that there were already several bodies lying scattered across the floor. At that moment, he clearly remembered that, in his past life, others had been found along with his injured sister. According to memory, one of the bodies belonged to the son of an extremely important man named Discard. The young man on the ground was undoubtedly Discard's son, who had been eliminated along with his entire escort. Observing closely, he understood that all of it had been planned to provoke a conflict between two rival families. He recalled the torn flag, the destroyed banners, and that environment clearly staged to simulate a war scenario. He was fully aware that, if discovered, it could unleash unimaginable chaos in that kingdom. For that reason, he quickly pulled an object from his belt, determined to destroy any trace of that scene. Wasting no time, he set fire to the entire old house, preventing any evidence from being found. He placed his sister on his back, determined to protect her, and began to move quickly away from that place. What he didn't know was that he was being watched by someone hidden, lurking in the shadows. Just as mysteriously as they appeared, that person vanished again, leaving absolutely no trace behind. That individual, who witnessed everything, then went to report the events directly to the one who had hired them. They were harshly questioned, for they hadn't even managed to eliminate a single child, something considered extremely shameful. But they responded by saying they had sent their best man and still failed. Kneeling in the middle of the room, they shouted in anger that it was all Ghislaine Pertium's fault. The men gathered around that round table were shocked, as they had always considered that boy completely useless. One of the superiors was convinced that his subordinate was using that name merely as an excuse. But the hooded man insisted that Pertium was very different from the information and rumors he had received. He said that he had observed everything unfold and could recount every movement the boy made while using his mana. He explained how the boy had easily defeated the bodyguards and the knights sent in that failed attack. He reported that even Frank, his well-trained man with the hat, had very little chance against him. He detailed each step of the fight between Frankie and that young prodigy from the Pertium lineage. Finally, he told how the man exploded along with his mana, destroying the entire old house. He claimed that the boy seemed like a completely different person, clearly very well trained. Despite everything, he assured that he had conducted the events as agreed, and the territorial war didn't matter. He asked for another chance, and unanimously, everyone wanted him to eliminate Pertium immediately. However, a man who had been silent until then spoke up, complaining that the place was too noisy. This man questioned what kind of chance the hooded figure was seeking with such conviction. The hooded man, furious, answered while looking at everyone at the table, promising to eliminate that annoying boy once and for all. They asked how he planned to do that, and he answered that it would be through a duel. He said he already had someone in mind to resolve it quickly and efficiently. The table found the proposal interesting, so one of them asked who exactly this challenger would be. The hooded man replied that his name was Cain Loges, known for his strength-based fencing. He commented that, despite being young, Cain was extremely respected for his muscular body and colossal strength. He further revealed that the muscular man and the troublesome young boy were cousins, making a possible encounter easier. After this revelation, the members of the table fell silent, reflecting on the unexpected proposal. One of them warned that if he failed again, the consequences would be far more severe than before. With a cruel look, he made it clear that there would be no third opportunity for that incompetent subordinate. The man then swore that this time he would not disappoint and would complete his mission without failure. Meanwhile, in the palace, in a training room, a very different scene was unfolding. The old knight Fergus, always attentive, asked for permission to enter, finding the young master in training. He was completely shocked when he realized the boy was training mana and swordsmanship simultaneously. Watching closely, he realized that this training was exceeding any expectations he could have imagined before. The young master's progress was unbelievable, reaching advances that seemed impossible in such a short time. Still playing with the sword, the protagonist said, satisfied, that this should already be enough. He then sensed the presence of the old knight and understood that he had something important to say. Fergus bowed respectfully, apologizing as he didn't want to interrupt the young master's training. The old man wanted to know how he had performed such an uncommon and unexpected move during training. The protagonist answered effortlessly, showing that he created mana lines to firmly support his sword. The knight was completely shocked to see that he was manipulating mana as if it were an accessory. The young man then remembered Frank and realized that he had always done this during his past life. Now he only used a single thread of mana, conserving energy and making the technique much more efficient. Fergus commented that even after training mana for years, he had never seen anything so complex and advanced. Thinking to himself, the old man reflected that the boy hadn't even known how to use mana until recently. The protagonist then asked why Fergus had come at this specific time. The old knight replied that he had come to thank him for protecting the young lady recently. Surprised, the protagonist didn't understand the reason for the thanks, as he considered it simply his natural obligation. A few days passed, and the festival was eventually paused, something inevitable after the recent events. It was natural after all. A knight had tried to kidnap the young lady, which caused a huge uproar. The young lady was now sad, as no one believed it was her brother who had truly saved her. Sitting at the table, she looked directly at her brother, clearly waiting for him to finally say something. Meanwhile, Belinda was furious just remembering that Jamolin Phillips had tried to commit such an atrocity. Despite this, the protagonist looked at the girl, feeling relieved because his sister had managed to survive unharmed. Looking out the window, he thought that he had managed to prevent a war, but he knew they wouldn't give up easily. He realized he couldn't stop them alone forever, so he urgently needed to build his own military strength. While reflecting, a maid entered the room, bringing dinner and momentarily interrupting his thoughts. As she served the dish, the young man reflected that he might need to urgently get involved in politics. Looking at his plate, he was surprised to see a very small portion, which caused immediate astonishment. He asked Belinda why they were starting with dessert, and she replied with a slight smile. She said that he should already know, being well aware of the current financial situation of their completely broken family. While still complaining, they heard a shrill voice echoing from the window, drawing everyone's attention in the room. Outside, a large fat man was shouting, demanding immediate compensation for the unexpected cancellation of the festival. This man was accompanied by several angry peasants, all demanding to be compensated for their suddenly lost profits. They insisted that the lords of that house appear immediately to resolve the issue urgently. Amid the commotion, the protagonist approached the window to get a better look at what was happening. Belinda, seeing him approach, said she already knew this would inevitably happen today. She explained that they were merchants who lived off the festival's profits and had hoped to repeat their previous earnings. The sudden cancellation of the festival after only one day had made everyone truly furious. The protagonist had no idea that the county's economic situation was so critical. He realized that if they didn't act quickly, the peasants would grow increasingly agitated and potentially violent. Through the window, he asked old Fergus where the soldiers were who should be calming the angry crowd. Laughing, Fergus informed him that there were absolutely no guards present on that particular day. Most of the soldiers had been deployed to posts in the monster forest, carrying out reconstruction work. Looking at the map, he recalled that Pertium was constantly at war with the wild northern barbarians. In addition, they also faced monsters that frequently emerged from the forest, attacking anyone they encountered. And to make matters worse, they had no money, no soldiers, and no resources to deal with such problems. He pulled Belinda aside, saying they needed to seriously talk about the financial situation of that territory. When he asked if she was the one managing the money, Belinda just widened her eyes in desperation. Upon hearing that he wanted to use money to calm the merchants, she replied that there was nothing. This completely surprised the young man, who questioned why they had absolutely no available resources. Belinda explained that the Count, her father, had recently cut off the children's allowances entirely. Faced with that, the protagonist realized he was now young, broke, and practically without any authority. He tried to ask if he could borrow something from her, but Belinda said she had nothing either. He sat on the window ledge, observing that desperate situation, completely lost, with no money, no soldiers, and no way out. Not even with all his knowledge of the future could he solve this without any resources at all. As he was thinking, hurried footsteps echoed toward the young master, someone coming to deliver news. One of the few remaining soldiers arrived running, immediately looking for the young master, who was still seated. It was Ricardo, one of the commanders, who arrived in a rush and visibly nervous, which left the young man quite intrigued. The protagonist wanted to know the reason for such urgency, and Ricardo replied that there was a problem. He informed him that young Master Kane urgently wanted to see him, without giving many details about the reason. Upon hearing that name, the protagonist didn't immediately associate it with anyone he knew. While they spoke, he noticed the commander's face was badly bruised, covered in deep welt. He seemed unable to defend himself, as he kept taking punches from an absurdly muscular arm. The blows didn't stop, hitting his face and chest repeatedly, with no visible signs of fatigue. They were so intense that even the commander's strong armor was completely crushed within minutes. When Ricardo was thrown to the ground, the protagonist appeared at the doorway, witnessing that exact moment. He saw his commander on the floor, with one eye completely swollen and the other nearly blind. The commander's condition was terrible, practically unrecognizable, barely able to utter a word in that desperate moment. When he tried to call the protagonist's attention, he was met with a fierce glare full of indignation. The man responsible looked down from above, trying to intimidate the young man with his sheer size. That colossal figure was at least twice, perhaps more, the height of the protagonist. Still, the blonde youth merely looked up, unfazed by that towering wall. That burly man remained vivid in his memories, and he remembered him very well. He was the heir to the County of Logs, with whom they had an alliance, his only friend. He had also been his greatest enemy, and now they stared at each other in a silent duel. The man descended the stairs, approaching the fallen commander who still trembled uncontrollably. The young man asked Soldier Ricardo what had happened inside that dark, mysterious cave. The soldier, head lowered, said they responded to a reported disturbance in the cave. He reported that, upon arrival, they found the man surrounded by an escort and recognized him immediately. The man soon began questioning whether the rumors about Pertium were true, pressuring the commander. The commander tried to explain the details, but was grabbed by the neck and silenced by force. The man believed he was being deceived, so he tightened his grip as punishment. The soldier went on, saying that the rest he had witnessed with his own eyes. Meanwhile, the big guy ordered that, if the soldier spoke, he at least tell the truth. Observing the swollen and prostrated commander, he said he had only given him a few light taps. He asserted, from a superior position, that nothing would have happened if the commander hadn't lied so blatantly. The protagonist was clenching his fist, staring at the big guy with eyes full of old memories. Back then, he truly acted this way, treating everyone as inferior and demanding absolute obedience. The protagonist remembered the countless times he was dragged by the hair by that man. No one dared to oppose the selfish and dangerous actions of that man, feared by the entire court. His behavior revealed a deep inferiority complex that overflowed in impulsive and authoritarian actions. It was believed that this was why he was always criticized, but everyone turned a blind eye. Meanwhile, the big guy observed the protagonist's expression and raised one eyebrow in provocation. Before, he would have reacted thoughtlessly, but now he seemed to hold back, restraining himself by a thread. In the past, someone had appeared with a proposal to eliminate Ghislaine, and he listened without hesitation. A hooded man suggested that, if he completed the task, his family would be supported. The man thought it was easy to deal with that brat, but he knew the young man was also in hair. Then the hooded man advised him to provoke a dispute to create an opportunity for a duel. He made it clear that it would be a one-time chance, even for someone as lacking in subtlety as him. The man said he never thought of facing his cousin, but ended up accepting with a smile. He stated that they would go to the proper place to provoke a situation that would lead to a challenge. Looking at the hooded man, he found that obsession with eliminating his cousin because of change absurd. Even so, he decided to obey, thinking there would be no harm in acting according to the received proposal. He looked at the protagonist and asked what he was doing, but was completely ignored. The man then sat on a step and asked why he was standing still if he was there. Insisting on the provocation, his cousin mentioned the festival with a provoking smile and mocking tone. Widening his eyes, he asked if the protagonist didn't remember the promise made at that festival. The young blonde simply looked to the side with his hands in his pockets and an indifferent expression. Raising one eyebrow, he asked if he was really talking about that so inopportunely. The big guy wanted to insinuate that the protagonist always had women and alcohol guaranteed at his disposal. He remembered that he himself had promised this once to avoid a beating that never came. However, the protagonist recalled the conversation with Belinda and the current lack of money, and looking at the man, a sudden idea occurred to him that seemed brilliant and genius. His blue eyes focused on the big guy, realizing he had been standing right in front of him the whole time. That man was a constant and living source of money, and now he intended to take advantage of it. This thought was interrupted when the man called him in a threatening and impatient tone. The big guy said it was better for him to do what he wanted quickly and not annoy him. Approaching him, the protagonist stated that he would be quick and wouldn't waste time with unnecessary explanations. Getting closer, he asked if he didn't have an enormous debt to pay off immediately. The hooded man, hearing this, found the direction of the conversation between the two provoking cousins strange. Sitting on the step, the man looked up, wanting to know exactly what he was talking about. The protagonist reminded him that he had always done everything that was asked, using his own money. The man raised an eyebrow, saying that everything had been done only out of sincere friendship. But the protagonist asserted that they were not friends, but master and servant, demanding immediate payment. Walking directly toward him, he He threatened to beat him a little if he didn't settle his debt right then. The hooded man watched in silence, while the soldier next to him observed the scene, completely horrified. Shivering, the soldier thought that the young master had used dangerous words without considering the consequences. The man then slowly stood up, looking the protagonist up and down with a tense expression. Still, the protagonist kept his hands in his pockets and the same serene attitude as always. The big guy noticed his confidence, glaring at him and saying that he had gone mad believing the rumors. Clenching his fist and preparing to attack, the man shouted that he was just a mere parasite. Pulling his body away and swinging his arm back, he ordered him to return to his place. Even seeing the blow coming, the protagonist didn't move, remaining still and alert. With precision, he dodged at the right moment, causing the opponent's attack to be completely wasted. Soldier Ricardo and the hooded man, seeing this, reacted with great astonishment and bewilderment. Meanwhile, the big guy became enraged for being ignored, feeling humiliated in front of all those present. With agility, the protagonist dodged and initiated a counterattack, taking advantage of the enemy's low guard. The blow to the abdomen was so intense that the man widened his eyes and bent over. Not stopping there, the protagonist followed up with a flurry of strikes, smothering any attempt at retaliation. Unable to defend himself, the man raised his hands to his face in a desperate attempt to protect himself. Still, the protagonist only intended to intimidate him. He wasn't trying to seriously hurt him at that moment. Even so, the big man was already crouching, coughing hard and unable to catch his breath. The hooded figure quickly approached, asking if the young master was all right after those insane blows. The protagonist, hands in his pockets, simply asked his cousin to stop the drama and get up. The hooded one ordered him to back off, saying he had already hurt the young master too much. Suddenly, the people in the tavern noticed the protagonist's insolence and began to watch him. He glanced sideways at everyone watching, realizing that not a single word had been spoken. With a subtle smile, he saw through their plan, which was clearly a staged performance. The big man asked the hooded figure if his acting had been convincing enough in that moment. With a wide smile, the hooded one replied that he had done well and that his performance was perfect. He believed it was a great opportunity and needed to do his best to make a good impression. Kane recalled the moment the hooded one promised to help his family if he cooperated. That's why he believed this was the perfect chance to bring down the decaying rival family. At that moment, the man pulled off a glove from his coat, saying he wouldn't accept such a disgraceful act. But before he could throw his own glove, one hit him in the face, signaling the start of a duel. The protagonist looked straight at him, formally declaring his challenge to Kane's logs for a fair duel. As the glove slid off his face, the man widened his eyes, frustrated by the missed opportunity. The protagonist kept speaking, saying he had been insulted publicly, being the legitimate heir of Pertium. He also said that Kane's had injured a knight worthy of upholding the ideals of Pertium. These words left the soldier shocked, unable to believe the young master's boldness in front of everyone. With his blue eyes fixed on his cousin, he asked if he wouldn't decline the proposed challenge. The unexpected question caught both Kane's and the hooded one off guard, leaving them without an immediate reaction. Kane's then smiled and said his cousin was crazy, but there was nothing he could do about it now. He placed a hand on his back, drew his sword, and said he would accept the duel with honor. He warned that the young man would deeply regret it later, once he lost his life to the edge of his blade. As he said this, he raised the sword before the protagonist, with a threatening and determined look. Still staring him down, the protagonist called for the soldier, who quickly responded to the young master's command. He asked him to bring all the merchants protesting in front of the castle to that location. He wanted everyone present, for a true spectacle was about to take place in that spot. When the festival was canceled, the atmosphere had already been heated to its limit, leaving tourists regretful. Now everyone seemed to be burning up inside from not being able to spend all the money they had saved. Given that, the protagonist devised a situation that could draw the attention of everyone gathered. He created a sort of improvised arena and made the merchants the paying audience for his idea. They encouraged the merchants to bet on whoever they believed more likely to win the duel. All those who were used to just boots and consumption would now have a much greater entertainment. Beyond the tents set up around, there was also the promise of a truly spectacular fight. To place a bet, one only had to get in line and hand over the desired amount to the organizers of the duel. Coins dropped abundantly on the ground as the bettors chose between the young master and the visitor. The big man drove his sword into the ground and announced that the anticipated duel was about to begin. He was visibly annoyed, believing it disrespectful to turn something sacred like a duel into a commercial show. Even so, the man declared that before the fight, he needed to say something, or his sword wouldn't settle. The protagonist just listened and didn't reply to what he considered a direct insult to his honor. He recalled how the hooded one and the big man had watched him and sensed their hidden intentions. Now that he had gathered enough people around, the duel could finally begin as planned. However, the hooded figure asked him to wait a bit longer before starting the fight. He claimed to suspect that the betting system wasn't being conducted honestly or fairly. The bettors were confused, unsure of what the hooded man intended to reveal at that moment. The man responsible for the bets confessed it was true. No one had placed a bet in favor of the young master. The protagonist turned slightly and gave a sharp look to the man handling the wagers. According to him, he had bet against the young master because he didn't believe he could win that tough battle. Laughing at the situation, the protagonist's cousin commented that even the gamblers had lost faith in him. The big guy then suggested changing the type of bet, focusing on the duration of the fight rather than the winner. At that moment, another person entered the scene and reinforced the idea of betting on the time of the battle. The commander placed a sack of coins and bet all the money on young Master Ghislaine. Upon hearing this, the protagonist gave a modest smile, showing no significant reaction to the gesture of support. Soon, another amount was added, thrown firmly over the money already placed by the confident commander. It was Helina and Belinda, who decided to bet firmly on the brother and master beloved by both. The attitude surprised both the commander and soldier Ricardo, who didn't expect such emotional involvement. It also caught the protagonist's attention, as he never imagined seeing his sister taking sides so clearly. Many inhabitants of the county were intrigued to see Helina publicly supporting her brother in such a risky situation. Angrily, the young woman asked the betting organizer if that amount wasn't more than enough. In response, the hooded man changed his expression, noticing that many were showing true confidence in the protagonist. Even young Master Keynes showed some contempt, now seeming even more disgusted with the situation. The protagonist then declared that, being older, he thought it unfair to start the duel at an advantage. He firmly gripped his sword, holding the hilt with strength and the scabbard with an unusual gentleness. With precise movements, he cut the air with the sword and repositioned it in resting mode. He looked directly at his opponent and silently invited him to make the first move of the duel. The rival kept his disdainful expression but chose to remain silent in the face of the direct provocation. The cousin commented that it was too late to pretend to act like a responsible older brother. Without hesitation, he charged toward the protagonist with a direct and brutal attack, aiming to strike him from above. The blow was blocked with difficulty by the protagonist, who raised his sword at the last possible moment. While Keynes shouted that it was too late for regrets, the protagonist kept his focused expression. Despite the strength of the blow, the protagonist resisted and soon began dodging quickly to survive. Meanwhile, Keynes attacked with everything he had, trying to strike him in a devastating and decisive way. The protagonist's agility was inferior, and many thought he was just afraid to fight. The protagonist's defensive style began to make the opponent more confident and careless. In reality, it was all part of a plan to make the rival comfortable in his zone. The gamblers watched in absolute silence, not realizing the true reason behind the passive stance. The hooded man concluded that Ghislaine had fallen into a trap by agreeing to fight in that armed duel. It was evident that the opponent was only focused on attacking and didn't leave openings for direct counterattacks. This way, he would wear himself out, and Keynes would simply wait for the right moment to finish the fight. That's how he conducted his duels, always waiting until his opponent was too exhausted. Even the big guy admitted that Keynes was better than he had imagined, with above-average skills. He also realized that the rival was able to dodge more easily than he had anticipated. Suddenly, Keynes held his sword in an inverted grip, using the hook on the hilt as an advantage. With this move, he managed to pull the protagonist and throw him up with extreme brutality. When the protagonist was in the air, Keynes prepared to deliver the final blow without hesitation. The crowd watched in shock, already believing that the young master wouldn't have a chance to react. Even the hooded man smiled, convinced that the duel would end immediately. As he fell from above, the protagonist heard shouts for him to be finished off mercilessly. But that was precisely the moment he had been waiting for to truly begin his combat. At first he had considered taking it easy, but he changed his mind after being thrown so violently. Filled with rage, he charged toward his opponent, declaring that he had crossed all the limits. In the blink of an eye, he was face to face with the enemy, surprising with his speed. Keynes hadn't expected such a sudden approach and immediately tried to strike the protagonist, determined. However, the protagonist dodged with agility, avoiding the counterattack with a movement almost impossible to follow. Everything happened so quickly that even the big guy couldn't react in time to stop the strike. The hooded man realized that the protagonist was using mana to stabilize his fall and regain control. Now Ghislaine was determined to eliminate the opponent with precision, without hesitating for a single moment. Already positioned behind the opponent, he stated that his fencing was ignorant and lacked technique. He wanted to open his cousin's eyes, and with sword raised, he prepared for the lesson. Keynes stared at him with hatred, questioning how his rival intended to reveal the truth in such a way. Ghislaine moved masterfully, with flawless footwork, striking his opponent where he least expected. When the big man tried to retaliate, the protagonist simply spun his body and assumed a superior position. He He leaped above his opponent and prepared to deliver the final blow with full efficiency and precision. The surprising movement enraged Keynes, who shouted in frustration at not being able to hit him even once. Ghislaine was clearly more agile, and his blocking skills were more refined than ever. He even stepped on Keynes' sword to dodge another strike and retreat. With a determined look, he positioned himself correctly and prepared for the decisive strike against his enemy. He was so fast that Keynes didn't even notice the exact moment he had lost the fight. The blonde young man with blue eyes had done it all without showing a hint of remorse for winning. Now the big man lay wounded, with serious injuries, without even realizing when he had been hit with such precision. Everyone watching the duel was in shock, and the initial excitement completely vanished from the atmosphere. Although they recognized the young master's progress, no one could believe he had actually won. Not even Belinda could believe it, but Helina, arms crossed, seemed to know what would happen, just like the commander who had already seen him fight orcs and didn't doubt his abilities. However, the hooded figure was deeply irritated by the outcome, having failed once again. Keynes, with nearly fatal injuries, thought his cousin hadn't finished him off simply because he didn't want to. Consumed by hatred, he refused to accept that this brat could have evolved so much in such a short time. He began to stare at the protagonist, who still stood tall with his sword firmly in hand. The protagonist noticed the look and returned it, showing he was ready to keep fighting if necessary. Then, with disdain, he tossed his sword aside and said he would fight using only his fists. Even so, the gesture wasn't enough to calm the fury of the humiliated and offended big man. Looking at his cousin, the protagonist stated it would be a great way to educate him by force. He sincerely believed there was no more effective way to teach than with a proper beating. Raising one of his eyebrows, the big man wanted to know if that brat really dared to try educating him. Rolling up his sleeves, the young man concluded he was right, and that was exactly what he would do with his fists. For that reason, he decided to raise the stakes, doubling the initial bet, as he was certain he would win. For all those who had bet against him, doubt arose, as this was supposed to be just a duel. Even the hooded one found the protagonist's behavior strange. He was sweating and found it odd that the boy wanted to face him barehanded, but thought maybe not all was lost. The man in charge of the bets shouted that everyone should take advantage and place new wagers. Once again, all eyes turned to the arena, and most chose to bet against the protagonist. However, those who had bet on him from the beginning remained firm, observing his posture. Keynes found it absurd that this skinny kid wanted to fight hand-to-hand against someone as big as him. Just in case, he gripped his sword handle tighter and took off his coat, throwing it aside. With the sword in hand, he announced that he would keep using it, although the protagonist had done nothing to stop him. Belinda muttered that young Master Keynes was an idiot for insisting on using a sword while the other would only use fists. The big man didn't care, as he considered it a sword duel and would remain faithful to his choice. The protagonist stuck to his word, stating he needed to teach him a lesson in a different way. With clenched fists and a boxing stance, the protagonist began to dodge, always searching for an opening. Meanwhile, the big man couldn't land a single hit, growing frustrated with his opponent's agility. The protagonist's footwork became faster and more consistent. This made Keynes' enormous body seem slow and confused in the face of the attacks. As soon as the protagonist noticed an opening in the opponent's guard, he charged in swiftly to strike. He then launched a series of consecutive punches, determined to teach that arrogant man a serious lesson. Now Keynes was in serious trouble, taking one hit after another. At one point, a punch to the chin was so strong that it made him snap his head to the side. Without even realizing how, Keynes was already kneeling on one leg, stunned by the impact. Looking down, he realized he had failed both with his sword and with his own fists. What ran through his mind was how someone so weak could perform such precise movements. Meanwhile, everyone watching the duel noticed that young Master Ghislaine was on a far superior level. The protagonist looked at the fallen man and told him to get up, for the lesson of the day had barely begun. Now the opponent was filled with rage and determined to eliminate the one who had embarrassed him. With his sword in hand, he charged at the protagonist, who stood still with his fists clenched. Another footwork game began, with the protagonist easily dodging the attack. The big man couldn't understand what was happening as before. The blonde had barely had the courage to face him. Now, however, he seemed strong enough to intimidate him, which made the protagonist firmly grab the opponent's arm and prepare to advance. With the rival completely immobilized, the protagonist began a series of knee strikes. While taking the blows, Keynes tried to stay strong, thinking he needed to ensure his family's success. However, his constant hesitation and low guard made it impossible to regain control of the fight. What was seen were sequences of punches, kicks, knee strikes, and a series of lessons being applied. After some time, Keynes' body was visibly swollen, with bruises all over. The protagonist grabbed his hair, looked at his face, and said he pitied his father. The cousin only tried to murmur something, but the words didn't come out clearly. Ghislaine stated that the Count had helped that dying land only because of friendship with Keynes' father. It was a pity that the son had such a petty and different mindset. Looking at the bruised face of the one who had always been in control, the protagonist recalled the past. He remembered when the Count had sent constant aid to Pertium. On one of those occasions, the son questioned why he insisted on helping a cursed place. At the time, the Count responded with silence, until one day he said it was just because they were friends. Now Keynes heard the same words coming from the mouth of the little chicken who had just defeated him. Even with his bruised face, he was still taking the final blows of the lesson. Finally, he just closed his eyes and accepted the punishment without reaction. The enemy did nothing, only asking if he had finally learned the lesson. The question made Keynes open his eyes and see the protagonist's extended hand. The hand remained there, but the young man just lowered his head, too embarrassed to accept it. This gesture was enough for everyone around to understand his defeat. It made the bettors perplexed by the unexpected outcome of the duel. Some were angry, others scared, covering their mouths in astonishment. Among the many impressed, the hooded figure was one of them. On the other hand, those who had bet on Ghislaine celebrated with cheers, having earned a handsome sum. The young lady Helina was also radiant, for she had bet on her brother and was now rich. Angry, the hooded figure walked toward the loser with large, furious steps. Approaching, he yelled at Keynes, calling him an idiot for admitting defeat. The big man, struggling to get up, turned his face and asked him to leave, as he no longer wanted to participate in this. The hooded figure put his hand to his face, realizing he was involved in another mess for failing once again. The protagonist, already aware of everything, caught the attention of the hooded figure, asking what he would do this time. Smiling, he stated that the man should fulfill his duty, which made the other man turn immediately. The hooded figure questioned what he was talking about. With a firm voice, Ghislaine shouted that this man had volunteered to pay for all the food and drinks of the night. The situation became complicated for the hooded figure, who couldn't deny it without further compromising himself. In a desperate act, he shouted that he hadn't agreed to that and refused. Ghislaine placed his hand on his shoulder, saying that this was the price for losing to the link. The hooded figure fell silent in front of the veiled threat. With more firmness in his grip, Ghislaine asked him not to forget to add the extra amount. With a threatening aura, he warned that if the man ran away, he already knew what would happen. That presence clearly showed he wasn't playing around and wouldn't hesitate if necessary. Thus, the protagonist left the arena, with both opponents properly defeated. The castle stayed in celebration for a while, and the next day, the protagonist opened a chest in his room. Looking at the gold coins, he wondered if he could hire a small group of mercenaries with that amount. Now he needed to act wisely, as he needed to accumulate more money to fulfill his plans. Without realizing it, his sister and the servant Belinda entered the room. To both, he asked what they wanted there, staring at their persistent looks. His sister wisely asked where he intended to invest his money. He noticed the interest and asked if she wanted a share, but she replied she was just curious. Belinda said it was obvious where he should spend the money. She said that Miss Amelia's birthday was coming up and thought all of this had been for her. Now the sister thought he had done all of that because of his fiancée Amelia, but having a fiancée was still something new to him since he hadn't lived that part of the past. With a serious expression, he asked her if he had a fiancée at that point in his life. Belinda replied that he didn't need to be embarrassed because they were talking about Miss Amelia from the county of Highford. Upon hearing the woman's name and the county associated with her, his gaze immediately changed. Suddenly, he remembered the young woman as being like a silent spider weaving her web. She was considered a noble among nobles, the perfect apple desired by all of that powerful generation. In the future, she would be known as the Witch of the North, one of the main traitors who would ruin the kingdom. Now that he had knowledge of the future, he managed to form a slight smile for having a plan. Belinda asked when his father would return, and the maid replied that it would probably be in a week. He considered that this interval might be enough to safely put his plan into action. He said he would go to the county of Rayford, and Belinda urged him to calm down since it wasn't even the birthday. However, he stated that his visit wouldn't be out of kindness but to extract money from that young woman. Amelia was a girl with light brown hair, pale skin, and always impeccable, well-maintained clothing. Despite possessing an oddly threatening presence, she often carried out various charitable actions within her territory. At that moment, she was in a village handing out comfortable shoes to a needy, barefoot orphan. The girl thanked her sincerely while Amelia said that if anyone should walk barefoot, it should be herself. She asked the soldiers to provide food and shelter to the girl, and they quickly began taking turns. They carried boxes and more boxes of supplies destined for charity, benefiting many residents of the forgotten village. Upon returning, she walked home barefoot and then sat in the garden next to a white cat. The escorting knight Bernard was kneeling, washing the young woman's feet while she petted the animal. Meanwhile, she quietly remarked that her father had always demanded absolute obedience from the locals, but she said people tend to follow those who offer shelter and food in hard times. The knight replied that with actions like those, she had won the hearts of the people. The young woman looked at the man coldly and seemed dissatisfied with that, then placed her feet on him. With her feet on his face, she asked what had happened in the sword duel. Bernard apologized, stating that he preferred to avoid drawing attention since it still wasn't the right moment. While caressing the young woman's feet, he swore that his blade was meant solely for her. She always wanted to confirm that, saying she had already invested too much in that loyal knight. She grabbed his chin and stared deeply into his eyes, revealing her most wicked side. She said she forbade him from being weak, as she would not tolerate cowardice among those by her side. After that, they began to discuss the merchants, and Bernard said they were recovering funds from alleged sources. He had recruited soldiers who fled from Pertium, and now had a well-trained armed force. The young woman ordered that the organization's front remain as if it were just a simple trading guild. The conversation was interrupted when a servant arrived, informing them that someone was requesting an audience with her. Bernard went to the butler to stop the visit, saying that the young lady would not receive anyone. But upon learning that it was her fiancé, the young woman found it strange and decided to receive him. The butler was pale when announcing the visit and feared repeating exactly what he had heard. When he informed her that the young man knew about the merchants, both the young woman and Bernard turned visibly pale. In the hallway, the door to the reception room appeared closed, with the young woman sitting while holding her cat. The protagonist entered holding a simple flower, politely greeting Miss Amelia with a reserved smile. She showed no interest in talking, and even the cat seemed to react with hostility. She said it was unnecessary for someone to show up unannounced and still demand attention so early. The young man explained that his birthday was approaching and therefore he had brought a simple gift. He placed the flower on the table, saying he had gotten it from a nearby merchants guild. The flower's fragrance was soft and enchanting, but he mentioned the name of the guild, Pertium. Upon hearing that name, the young woman immediately realized the true intentions of that visitor. Annoyed, she stood up, saying she didn't understand what he was trying to suggest with such a provocation. She said she had already received the gift and that he could leave without causing further disturbance. However, the young man asked her to sit down, as he hadn't yet finished his financial proposal. Amelia widened her eyes as she felt an intense pressure coming from him that made her uncomfortable. The force he emanated was so great that the tea on the table began to tremble in silence. She cast a surprised sideways glance, remembering that he used to tremble even in front of women. Seeing that she had caught his attention, he stated that he wanted 10,000 gold coins as a loan. The young lady raised an eyebrow, considering his attitude extremely rude and bold for the situation. She soon lost control, shouting at him, asking if he thought he should place this as the Count's debt. The protagonist replied that her father had nothing to do with it since she intended to marry him. Amelia then shot one of the worst glares possible, the one reserved for bold traitors, but he continued and decided to reveal everything he knew about the secret association with the throne. Upon mentioning her hidden involvement, the white cat went wild and leaped off the armchair in fury. Even with the cat agitated, the young man remained firm, only observing and waiting for her final response. Amelia ordered him never to repeat such words, even as a joke, and stood up in anger. The young man responded that he could stay silent, but that would come at a price, and it depended on the amount. She smiled disdainfully and stated that she would never give him what he was asking for. She then called for the knight Bernard, who entered the room with firm steps and an imposing presence. He greeted the young Lord Ghislaine, saying it had been a long time since their last meeting. The protagonist cast a cold look, for he knew that man was her favorite swordsman. He also knew that he had the potential to become the best sword in all the North. Then he warned that if he were to die there, a war would certainly start without warning. But the young lady raised her hand, saying that everyone would believe an exile had tried to rob her residence. Touching the spider-shaped ornament, she ordered the knight to eliminate the nuisance immediately. Bernard drew his sword firmly, gripping the hilt with the determination of a veteran warrior. The protagonist watched attentively as they had chosen the hardest way to resolve this. If that was the path they intended to take, he wouldn't hesitate to respond in kind. And as the knight drew his sword, the protagonist also stood up and began to grip his own. Bernard merely stared with a serious look at the young lord, who seemed ready for anything. The protagonist then realized something was about to happen, as if a premonition was alerting him. Without even looking in the direction of danger, he already knew what the next move would be. The moment a figure appeared behind him with clear hostile intent, his decision was made. As the attacker pierced the sofa where he had been sitting just seconds earlier, the protagonist swiftly launched himself away from the furniture, allowing the strike to hit only the upholstery. In an agile and precise movement, he struck the stomach of the man who had attacked him with full force. The impact was so intense that the man flew through the window, taking the sofa with him, and fell outside. The speed and precision of the move visibly impressed both the young lady and her knight. The protagonist then turned his gaze toward the young lady and commented that pretending courtesy before a treacherous attack was strange. Saying he was ready to face her knight, he declared that the hospitality of this place was rather mediocre. The swords began to intertwine, with quick attacks and precise blocks in a lethal dance of steel. Despite the protagonist's fast movements, Knight Bernard managed to intercept the attack firmly. Looking at Bernard, young Kislane said that this county seemed to not understand the true meaning of chivalry. Still holding his sword after the block, Bernard retorted that the young man had been rude from the start. He then pressed his arm against the protagonist's blade and said that there was no more need for manners. Trying to strike with force, Bernard was surprised by Gislane's agility, who easily escaped the blow. With impeccable footwork, the protagonist struck Bernard, who was advancing aggressively. The unexpected strike caught Bernard off guard, but he didn't consider it a reason to worry too much. He then took a few steps back, seeking a more accurate analysis of the situation and his opponent. Bernard observed the young Kislane more closely and noticed that he didn't match the rumors at all. The firm stance and quick reactions showed he wasn't the useless dog many had claimed. The young lady, arms crossed, asked if her knight was having difficulties with a mere boy. Then, with a sad and disdainful tone, she said it might be better to eliminate the young man and present his head. With that, Bernard felt even more pressure and recognized that he couldn't lose this sword fight. Tightening his grip on the hilt, he promised his lady that he wouldn't disappoint her under any circumstances. He then pointed his sword at Gislaine and ordered him to come confront him with everything he had. Gislaine, however, knew his position well and asked the knight to avoid the mistake of giving him orders. Bernard, in turn, said he had merely done him a favor, and if it wasn't wanted, it didn't matter. He then took position to attack, saying he would simply act as he saw fit, with no more ceremony. In the next attack, Gislaine barely had time to dodge, as the movement had been incredibly fast. The cut on his face made it clear that Bernard was quick and would demand even greater speed from him. Bernard kept a stern expression and conveyed the intention that he would do whatever it took to win. The true clash had begun with an intense exchange of attacks, blocks, and counterstrikes. Amelia, while observing, wondered how someone called Useless could fight on equal footing with her best knight. More than that, it seemed that Gislaine had a slight advantage, even if only by a little. He kept dodging, blocking, and maintaining perfect positioning while attacking with precision. Bernard, on the other hand, showed no weakness or hesitation, staying firm in his technique. The young woman only observed in silence as the duel grew increasingly intense. At any moment, if one of them made a mistake, everything would end instantly. Once again, Bernard held the sword with his arm, just as he had done before. The protagonist responded with a spin, but this time slightly altered his movement. He then warned Bernard that he shouldn't fall for the same tricks twice in a row. With that, he executed an even more unexpected footwork maneuver, agile and innovative. However, by repeating part of the previous pattern, he realized Bernard had already anticipated it. With a faint ironic expression, Bernard said that trick wouldn't work again, and then, for the first time, Gislaine was thrown to the ground, landing hard on his back. He felt that he had pushed a little too far and needed to be more cautious. Bernard wouldn't miss such an obvious opening and prepared for the final blow. However, the protagonist was skilled not only with the sword but also with his body. Thanks to his refined technique, he performed an acrobatic leap upward, twisting his body in the air. With that movement, he understood that Bernard was using mana to increase his speed and precision. Meanwhile, Bernard walked toward him with both swords firmly in hand. After knocking Gislaine's sword away, he asked if he had trained with barbarians. He said that kind of fencing might be useful on a battlefield, but not against a knight like him. He was convinced that this would be the end of young Gislaine and that he would have the honor of finishing him. Ever since he had stepped into that territory, the protagonist knew the confrontation would be challenging. Bernard's attacks aimed precisely at his head, requiring increasingly sharp reflexes. It was then that he understood this was not an enemy to face just yet, not in the conventional way. Even so, already in position, Gislaine warned Bernard that he had no time to waste. He then used a thin thread of mana to pull his sword back as Bernard advanced. The knight quickly noticed the nearly invisible thread extending to the fallen blade. The magical line, thin as a hair, stood out for its precision and refined skill. The sword then struck Bernard from behind with the hilt, making his eyes widen in surprise and anger. The opening created allowed the protagonist to counterattack with his knee and swift, calculated strikes. Even so, Bernard managed to avoid the successive blows, demonstrating his experience in real combat. The young Amelia screamed desperately for Bernard, unable to believe he could lose. Meanwhile, the protagonist leaped with a sword in hand, ready for another aerial strike. The blade descended swiftly from above, forcing Bernard to raise his sword at the last moment to block. If he had hesitated, the blow would have struck him cleanly in the neck, ending the battle. The clash now took on even greater proportions, revealing the unique skills of both combatants. The protagonist stepped back once more, realizing he would have to better analyze his opponent's patterns. He knew that if it dragged on much longer, he would need to resort to his final strategy. He looked at Amelia and asked her to leave, as he could no longer guarantee her safety. She hesitated, but soon realized the battle was beyond her, and that interfering would be useless. Fixing his gaze on Ghislaine, Bernard announced that from that moment on, he would fight with everything he had. The protagonist smiled and said that was exactly how he liked to fight, without restraint or hesitation. He added that it had been a long time since he had faced someone as powerful and worthy as him. The young Amelia, promptly obeying her knight's orders, quickly left that dark and stifling room. She ran down the corridors carrying in her arms her long-haired, soft white cat. As he hurried forward, he reflected that that lord should never have treated her with such humiliation. He also mentally questioned who had revealed the guild's confidential information to the boy. During his escape, he began to believe that the rumors about them defeating some orcs might be true. However, upon seeing him for the first time, he found it strange that someone so useless could have accomplished such a feat. Hiding behind a large pillar, he questioned the whereabouts of the guards who should have been protecting his rear. However, he fell into absolute despair when he saw all the soldiers lying on the ground, with no signs of life. At the center of the scene, a hooded figure calmly watched, projecting her presence with unsettling silent tranquility. It was clearly a woman with white hair and pink streaks, her gaze cold, demonstrating unquestionable frigidity. She stated in a sharp tone that it had been a long time since she had served that spoiled young lady. Amelia was confused as she recognized her former maid, now dressed in typical mercenary attire. She tried to ask what was happening, but was quickly silenced with an authoritative and commanding gesture. Belinda approached unnoticed by Amelia, placing something sharp dangerously close to her pale neck. The young noble felt lost as she had fled precisely to save her life from threats like this one. Soon after, Belinda roughly pulled the spider that was trapped on the young lady's mouth. She commented that it was extremely strange, as she had already noticed the same spider at the engagement ceremony. She also revealed that she had heard Amelia's brothers laugh at her for being surrounded by spiders since she was little. While holding the spider with one hand, she said that it might have been an unresolved trauma. Without hesitation, she threw the insect on the ground and said it definitely didn't match her appearance. With a firm stomp, she crushed the spider completely, leaving only a dark stain on the stones. After destroying the creature, Belinda looked at the young lady and asked if she was willing to cooperate. Meanwhile, Amelia's knight remained locked in combat and unable to provide immediate assistance. The air around seemed heavier, and the protagonist could clearly feel the intensity emanating from the battle. The opposing knight wielded his sword with extreme precision, keeping his eyes fixed on his direct opponent. Even so, the protagonist remained firm, informing the knight that he was on the same level as the young noble lady. He also said that his rival was speaking only the kind of things a mere mercenary would dare pronounce. In turn, the young noble retorted firmly, claiming to also be noble and deserving of respect. He stated that a mere escort knight had no authority to speak to him so freely. Bernard the knight refused to listen to the provocations coming from that reckless lord who knew no boundaries. He declared that this irresponsible young man could not stain the sacred name of true nobility in the kingdom. It was then that the protagonist noticed Bernard's movements becoming rougher and more aggressive. However, having been the king of mercenaries in his past life, he knew how to defend himself perfectly. Despite this, he was now forced to react with greater speed and calculate each step he took with precision. Each sword strike from the enemy came dangerously close to vital areas, increasing the tension of the fight. The margin for error was null, and the protagonist knew he couldn't falter for even a second. He limited himself to blocking and dodging, maintaining a defensive posture while searching for a decisive opening. He determined that this situation couldn't continue and decided to abandon defense to counterattack with full force. He launched himself ferociously against Bernard, taking the offensive even though he didn't know if he would cause a significant impact. The knight, in turn, remained vigilant, delivering blows with calmness and a cold, unshakable expression. However, Bernard noticed that his sword was being increasingly pressured by his rival's continuous attacks. From the determined look on the young man's face, the fight truly seemed close to an inevitable and irreversible end. Still, Bernard arrogantly asked if the protagonist had any last words before defeat arrived. The protagonist responded with silence, as he had already clearly visualized the conclusion of this arduous battle. The final move came as a surprise, and Bernard was struck with his guard down. With no time to react, the protagonist used his rear leg and shoulder to change the angle of the sword. Thus, the blow that should have been fatal became just a scratch on the shoulder, to Bernard's frustration. Bernard understood that he could no longer underestimate that young man, as any slip-up would be a fatal mistake. The intensity of the fight increased, and now both were completely engaged in an evenly matched and fierce duel. The knight also employed techniques with his feet, and asked if he should show what true strength was. After delivering a kick that sent the protagonist flying, he smiled provocatively. Even while lying on the ground, the young noble maintained a smile, considering the man a great adversary for entertainment. Watching the exchange of blows closely, he admired the reach and efficiency of Bernard's attack. He realized that any attempt to change the course of the fight was blocked with impressive speed and precision. In the clash between swords, the impact seemed to fuse them together, Such was the control of mana applied by the knight. The protagonist understood that, with his current mana, it would be impossible to surpass the enemy's brute strength. He gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, saddened by the decision he would have to make at that crucial moment. However, there was something Bernard had yet to notice, and that would change the direction of that tense fight. The protagonist focused, expanded his mana core, and then opened a third core in continuous succession. With that, he released all the stored energy and activated a cultivation technique considered extremely rare and powerful. He decided to apply this extra force against Bernard, holding his sword firmly while the opponent used only one hand. The attacks became more intense, and with a fierce strike, he managed to knock the sword from the opponent's hands. Bernard was surprised to see his weapon disarmed by someone who, until then, had seemed inferior. He stared at the young man, not understanding how he could maintain such explosive mana throughout the fight. The tip of the protagonist's sword now rested dangerously close to the forehead of the defeated knight. It was at that moment that he declared the end of the duel, while Belinda still kept Emilia under control. The young lady, forced to witness her knight's defeat, declared that she would give the protagonist the requested amount. However, the young man said she should have been kind and cooperative from the start of the conversation. After hearing what he needed, he slowly pulled the sword away from Bernard's forehead, officially ending the battle. Belinda, in turn, commented that he shouldn't speak harshly to his future noble wife. Approaching Emilia with the sword resting on his shoulder, the protagonist said he had unpleasant news to deliver. After all the effort of that fight, he confessed that he was exhausted and now wanted double the agreed payment. The scene left by the protagonist was one of colossal destruction, caused with terrifying precision and brutality. Frustrated, the young lady threw a flower vase to the ground while her cat hid away. She was speaking with her knight, displaying fury at both of them having been humiliated so disgracefully. Bernard was deeply saddened for not meeting the standards expected by the young lady at that moment. The woman asked the knight if that young lord had really changed so much since the last time. Faced with her doubt, the knight asked if she wanted that reported to Duke Delphine. The woman became hysterical, slapping the knight across the face, who kept his hands clasped behind his back. She grabbed the collar of his shirt, saying that if he said anything, both of them would suffer greatly. She revealed that she had allied with the Duke due to a pact that could not be revealed. She said that if that meddler had discovered the secret of the Merchants Guild, he would also know about the agreement. For that reason, they both had to act immediately before they completely lost control of the situation. The knight agreed with the assessment, knowing the risk was greater than it appeared at first glance. She then wanted to know the current condition of Lord Ghislaine's body at that exact moment. The knight replied that he had a deep wound on his left shoulder and had spent a lot of mana. He believed it would be dangerous if anything happened, especially if caused by knights from that same land. The woman, handling objects on her desk, said she had just thought of a new strategy. She gave the knight a look, saying that was what they had trained those specific people for. The knight was surprised by the young woman's strategy, which seemed to have been thought out quickly and precisely. She wanted to use the wild cats, an elite group secretly trained for a long time. They consisted of war orphans, with no family or status, formed only by the best and most versatile specialists. The young lady moved a piece with a blue flag on the board, naming them the Wild Cat Traffickers. She ordered the knight to gather all of them in that region, asking only for those with proficiency. The knight understood that the use of mana was essential for moments like that in particular. It was a mountainous region amid the forest, considered the only path between two separate territories. The knight knew exactly the ideal spot to organize an effective ambush against any hostile advance. The woman was sure the protagonist would come to erase her for all the humiliation she had suffered earlier. After departing by carriage, the protagonist tended to his wounds using the money he had obtained from her. He thought of the young woman's name, recalling it was Emilia, with a certain contempt. Inside the carriage, old Fergus asked the young lord if he was really feeling okay. Showing his injured arm, he said it wasn't deep and he was managing the situation well. Looking back, he thought that the 20,000 he had given to Emilia covered all the necessary expenses. He truly wanted to have her eliminated, but he knew that a war would erupt if he did so. He also knew that the barbarians cause instability in the territory, so he shouldn't provoke any more chaos. As he put on his coat, he thought that just knowing the Merchant Guild was enough. This time, he would make good use of the girl and the information obtained through her without hesitation. Meanwhile, he looked ahead and noticed that his servant Belinda was silent, merely observing. Suddenly, she asked the lord if things were unfolding as planned. She said she had followed his orders, accompanying the guards after hearing noises inside the room. However, the young man had instructed Fergus to handle that, not Belinda, to avoid getting involved. Although everything seemed fine, a sharp pain suddenly hit the protagonist's body. He bent over, feeling intense pain in his head and chest, leaving Fergus visibly worried. Looking at his hand, he realized it was the side effect of using the third core. While thinking of a way to increase his mana, Belinda unexpectedly held his hand. Making strange movements, the young man wondered what she was trying to do with that. She said the mana flow in his body was terrible, so she took a needle. With surgical precision, she began to apply small pricks to the young lord's hand, manipulating his energy. Quickly, all the pain seemed to disappear, leaving him visibly more stable and relieved. For a moment, he felt suffocated, as if the air was trapped, but then he managed to breathe deeply. Looking at himself again, he noticed that the tangled mana flow had partially cleared. Now he looked at Belinda and realized she wasn't just a simple maid as she appeared. He knew it was his mother who had brought Belinda to the castle, but there were still mysteries about her. He couldn't understand how a servant could have such refined skills and such effective techniques. He thought it would be good to have someone so powerful among his allies with the enemies that would come. Meanwhile, the carriage moved at a steady pace along the road shaded by the trees. Belinda looked at the young master and stated that she would always help him, as she trusted him completely. She asked why he had taken so much gold from Miss Amelia, questioning that strange decision. She and Fergus were shocked when the protagonist revealed that he only needed money, and she was rich. Both could hardly believe he had done that purely out of financial necessity at that moment. As the carriage continued, Belinda grew furious that he had broken off the engagement because of money. Even so, he looked at her firmly and asked if she still trusted him. Despite her anger, Belinda replied that she did trust him, but wanted to know what he would do with the gold. He became serious for a moment, then explained that everything was related to the Beast Forest. He told her that he intended to be the pioneer in that dangerous and practically unexplored place. Old Fergus tried to make him reconsider, but the young man remembered something requested before they entered the castle. Upon hearing this, Fergus' eyes widened, and he began to sweat, visibly shaken by that memory. He hesitated for a few seconds before responding, as if carefully choosing the right words. Finally, he said that the young man had asked him to search for something specific in a certain hidden place. The protagonist stated that, as long as he lived, he wouldn't have any trouble going to that mysterious location. Although everyone thought they were returning, he asked Belinda if she thought Amelia would seek revenge. Even boasting about being strong, the young man warned that he intended to use her in other strategic actions. He stated that he needed a vanguard, and they were going after that at that very moment. Soon, the carriage stopped in front of a humble house, and everyone got out cautiously. Knight Ricardo approached and knocked on the cabin's aged wooden door. After a few seconds, someone slowly opened the door, revealing a tall man with an unusual appearance. He had such thick eyebrows that his eyes were barely visible, hidden under the weight of his hair. With seriousness, he asked who they were and what they wanted, in a deep voice. Everyone was stunned by his appearance, finding the man frightening and hostile at first glance. Belinda whispered to the protagonist, believing that the man wasn't in any condition to fight anymore. The man just stared at them with a severe expression, bothered by the whispering of the noblewoman. Upon realizing they were nobles, the man tried to close the door and asked them to leave. However, the protagonist called him, referring to him as the former captain of the Ratatost mercenaries. Upon hearing his real name, Jillian, the man widened his eyes and glanced at the young lord. The lord extended his hand toward him, saying it was a pleasure to see him again after so long. Old Knight Fergus, upon hearing the name of the Ratatost mercenaries, was immediately extremely impressed. That group was famous for their bravery. Any knight, even a foreigner, knew their reputation perfectly. The captain of that renowned group was Gillian, the same man who was now discreetly observing the protagonist attentive. He still kept his hand extended, clearly expecting it to be met with a respectful greeting. However, from inside that simple house, a weapon unexpectedly flew violently toward them. But thanks to the protagonist's dexterity, the weapon only tore his cloak without causing any injury. In front of that extremely hostile action, the protagonist's three companions were absolutely shocked and tense. However, the man inside the house also seemed surprised and quickly raised his arm in greeting. But at that specific moment, both Fergus and Ricardo had already drawn their swords, ready for combat. The man, staring firmly at the protagonist, asked directly what the reason for their unexpected visit was. Immediately, Belinda, the loyal servant, drew a dagger and positioned herself in front of the protagonist to protect him. She persistently asked the protagonist to retreat, to stay behind her, keeping a distance from that dangerous man. However, the protagonist knew exactly what he needed to say and replied, seeking the eternal punishment. In response to that precise answer, the man had a flash of clarity, realizing that those words were correct. Watching carefully, the protagonist revealed that he knew the cure for the mysterious illness tormenting his daughter. He then asked firmly if this information would truly spark his interest. The protagonist was fully aware of the symptoms: high fever, constant cough, red spots resembling blooming petals. Additionally, the image of the young girl writhing in pain reminded him of a tortured prisoner, the origin of that terrible name. Upon hearing this, the man took a deep breath, immediately gave in, and allowed them to enter the humble house. Inside the residence, they saw the young Rachel desperately thrashing, visibly consumed by intense pain. That imposing man with long white hair held his daughter in his arms, trying to calm her lovingly. The protagonist realized that it wasn't too late, so he decided to try to recruit Jillian immediately. In his previous life, when he had encountered that man, it was too late. He had completely given up on life. Watching the poor conditions of the house, the protagonist understood that he had probably sold absolutely everything. Looking at the cruel suffering of the girl, whose skin was completely reddened, he felt the urgency of that critical mission. Therefore, the protagonist removed his coat and announced seriously that he would start the necessary treatment immediately. At that moment, someone grabbed his shoulder firmly. It was Belinda, visibly trying desperately to stop him right away. She insisted that they leave, clearly not knowing exactly what the protagonist intended to do there. She said, anxiously, that it was a serious illness, impossible to cure without specialized priestly help. Still, he completely ignored her pleas, asserting with absolute conviction that he would indeed cure that young woman. Staring directly into her eyes, he asked firmly if she truly trusted him fully at that critical moment. This made her partially regain her composure, remaining silent in the face of the situation. Soon after, he handed her a carefully written paper, requesting that she immediately purchase all those herbs. He emphasized that she should be extremely quick, as those ingredients were absolutely vital for the treatment. Upon closely examining the contents of that paper, Belinda realized that it was rare knowledge from true travelers. It became clear that the protagonist had advanced and specific knowledge directly related to the art of survival. Now he quickly opened his supplies bag, searching for all the necessary materials to make the proper medication. At that present moment, the disease known as eternal punishment had no cure, but in the future, there would be a solution. He then began pulling out various special ingredients from the bag, carefully organizing jars, bottles, and tools. The biggest problem was that the cost of those ingredients was absurdly high, something simply inaccessible to many. However, he was in possession of a flower blessed by fairies, something extremely rare and valuable. With extreme skill, he began carefully crushing that enchanted flower along with the selected medicinal herbs. Afterward, he placed everything carefully into a bottle, added a special liquid, and started mixing. He shook the bottle with precise movements, aiming to ensure that the elixir was homogeneous and properly activated. He knew that the mixture needed to rest for a few minutes before it could finally be used with proper safety. As he prepared that precious elixir, the three companions watched closely every move made by the protagonist. After a specific amount of time, the elixir was completely ready, stored in a small translucent bottle, carefully sealed. The protagonist then handed that bottle to the man, asking him to administer it immediately to his debilitated daughter. The man, without wasting any time, opened the bottle and carefully poured the liquid directly into the girl's mouth. He held her tenderly in his arms, ensuring she wouldn't choke while administering the medicine with full attention. Soon he noticed her expression slowly beginning to show clear signs of relief and visible improvement. Her skin also gradually lightened as the powerful medication began to take effect on her. The tears that had once fallen constantly ceased entirely, giving way to a peaceful and comforting sleep. The man beside his daughter, who now had only minor scrapes, watched her sleep with deep relief. Fergus also noticed that the red spots were disappearing quickly, and Belinda clearly saw the same thing. Visibly emotional, the man stared at his daughter, clearly realizing that the medicine was truly working well. In response, the protagonist informed the man that, as expected, the prepared medication was functioning perfectly. The man then turned to him, asking how he had managed to heal her if even divine power had failed. The protagonist explained that the divine power of the priests was not absolute, always depending on medical foundations. With trembling hands, the man firmly grabbed the young lord's arm, deeply moved and grateful for the help. Kneeling before him, he asked in a trembling voice if his daughter would really be completely healed soon. The protagonist, looking seriously into his eyes, replied that within a few months she would be fully recovered. That answer brought immediate hope to the heart of the man who, until then, had lived in utter despair. With that, he placed a hand over his chest, made a deep bow, and asked what he should offer in return. At that very moment, the man recognized that fate had guided him to that young master exactly when needed. He confessed sincerely that for now, all he had was that old, worn-out, and seemingly useless body. He declared that, if necessary, he would allow himself to be treated like a dog without hesitation. He also said that if the young man wished to make him a slave, he would accept that fate without resistance. However, the young lord responded firmly that he did not need slaves, but rather Captain Gillian. The man could hardly believe it when he realized the protagonist's hand was pointing directly at him at that decisive moment. He also noticed the intense blue in the young man's eyes, instantly recognizing them as the eyes of a true dreamer. He immediately grabbed his long white braids and mentally prepared to make a final, irreversible decision. With a precise strike of his hatchet, He cut off all those white braids at once without hesitation. He threw that hair to the ground as if the gesture symbolized a final farewell to a former empty life. All of this happened before the 4 attentive onlookers who were left completely speechless by such an instant transformation. The 3 companions of the protagonist could barely believe what they were seeing, so great was the change in that imposing man. It was hard to understand how someone once a captain of brutal mercenaries now acted so humbly and loyally. As soon as he cut his hair, his expression changed completely. Even his eyebrows seemed more lifted and firm. His entire aura transformed instantly, and the man who once walked hunched now stood absolutely upright. Looking directly into the protagonist's eyes, he asked if there was anyone else besides those present seeking him. The protagonist answered categorically, making it clear that only those already there were involved. Then, searching among the available weapons, he asked if anyone held a grudge against the young companions. The protagonist again responded with complete sincerity, saying yes, and that there would be more in the near future. Faced with that answer, the man gripped a spear tightly, saying that in that case, he needed to take immediate action. Right after that, he hurled the spear with tremendous force, breaking part of the wall of that humble house without mercy. He quickly pulled a rope tied to the spear, revealing that something was being dragged through the dense nearby forest. As he pulled, something resisted until finally someone appeared, caught in that ingeniously improvised trap. He held the intruder by the neck with extreme ease, leaving him completely immobilized before their shocked eyes. While the victim trembled in fear, the large man insistently questioned who had sent him to that specific place. The intruder could barely say anything, as before he could finish speaking, his opportunity was abruptly cut off. Captain Gillian looked directly at the protagonist, asking plainly what he should do with the captured man. The protagonist, who had already deduced who had sent that man, was considering whether or not to draw his blade. As he reached for the hilt of his sword, Gillian promptly stopped him, asking to handle it himself. Saying that he would personally take care of that minor problem, he tightened his grip on the helpless intruder's neck. After that, he simply hurled the man with immense strength far away without a trace of remorse. He then maintained a reverent posture, lowering his head slightly and once again placing a hand over his chest. Belinda clearly noticed that the man had not hesitated for even a second in faithfully fulfilling the orders given. She looked on, intrigued by the scene, inwardly questioning why her young master would recruit someone so dangerous. However, in that moment, the man solemnly swore that from that day forward, he would place his life in the hands of the Lord. Smiling in a friendly manner, the protagonist calmly replied that he looked forward to working side by side with him. Far from that location, in a wooden house near the river, a meeting was being held. Inside, the members of the Wild Cats, a well-known and feared mercenary team, were organizing strategies. Their leader, visibly irritated by the chaos, immediately demanded absolute silence from everyone. It was crucial that no one raise their voice, as this man, Vigo, proved to be extremely superior. Noticing that they had crossed the line, one of the subordinates quickly apologized to the stern captain. Achieved silence, Vigo responded, while relaying important information gathered by the spy Bernard. According to Bernard, their target should be near that unit, following that trail. However, Vigo became furious upon discovering that Gillian had allied with the current protagonist. His anger was so intense that he grabbed the informant by the neck, pressing with brutal force. His furious eyes demanded that the messenger confirm with absolute certainty the information delivered. Trembling and suffocated, the man in Vigo's grasp assured him that he had seen everything clearly. Vigo knew that Gillian was extremely dangerous. After all, he had been his former legendary captain. Meanwhile, Gillian himself was driving the carriage with a serenity that seemed to defy any danger. Belinda complained about the cramped space, made tight by the excessive weapons transported in the overstuffed carriage. She questioned whether the man really needed to have brought absolutely every weapon from that arsenal. Hearing her complaints, Ghislaine promised that he would buy another carriage in the future, especially to make Rachel more comfortable. In the carriage behind them were Fergus and Ricardo, who were providing escort and protecting the rear. Ghislaine then responded that Belinda needed to hold on, as every item had an indispensable use. He knew perfectly well that the road ahead was extremely dangerous, and escaping that gap was a priority. Belinda, suspicious, asked if the observer they had captured earlier had been sent by Miss Amelia. She raised suspicions because she noticed that the mask used by the spy bore the feline symbol. This detail clearly symbolized the Wild Cats, a powerful and famous mercenary guild in that region. Upon hearing this, Ghislaine only murmured softly, showing some discomfort, although he tried to remain calm. He remembered very well that the Wild Cats were involved in smuggling, trafficking, and other crimes. Belinda said that group was repulsive, accepting any kind of work without any scruples. The protagonist was intrigued, as she knew many details, even though she had never left the castle. Still, he accepted her excuse, as she said she had heard all of this around. He then looked directly at Belinda, and assured her that everything would be fine, no exceptions. After all, they had Gillian by their side, a man who was unbelievably useful, fierce, and nearly unstoppable. As they continued their journey, the starry night hid the subtle traces of aura left by their pursuers. The pursuers had already surrounded the carriage, creating a perfect cycle that seemed like a deadly trap. However, nothing escaped the keen eyes of the mercenary captain, the experienced and fearless Jillian. As the carriage continued its path, the wild cats emerged, slipping quietly from the dark shadows. Immediately, Jillian drew two different weapons from his back, clearly realizing that he had fallen into an ambush. Two enemies advanced at the same time, but Jillian defended both, using his weapons with perfect precision. The proficiency of that man seemed limitless, repelling both attacks at the exact same moment. He then delivered a warning strike with his axe, forcing one of them to retreat immediately. He had to cut one of the opponents slightly, leaving the first two completely out of combat. As the carriage moved forward, new traps appeared, activated by cleverly disguised ropes between trees and branches. Still, Jillian's watchful eyes as he drove the carriage remained as sharp as ever. He quickly realized that this specific trap was coming from above, requiring a precise maneuver with the reins. He pulled the reins at the exact moment, preventing the carriage and the horses from taking any damage. Inside the carriage, Ghislaine was already expecting an ambush, as they were now completely surrounded by enemies. Suddenly, more members of the Wild Cats appeared, blocking any possible escape route for the group. Among them was Vigo, who approached sarcastically greeting his former captain, Jillian, with absolute disdain. Jillian, with his white beard and stern gaze, responded only with a look of deep reproach. The leader of the Wild Cats, visibly irritated, accused Jillian of cowardice for abandoning the old guild. He bitterly complained that, because of him, he had to live a life he had never wanted for himself. Even being insulted, Jillian remained silent, listening as Vigo asked if he had completely lost his mind. Annoyed at being ignored, Vigo promised to make the old man remember, even if it had to be done by force. He ordered his subordinates to make sure no one was left intact, initiating an attack in a closed formation. Inside the carriage, Ghislaine calmly asked Jillian if he would need help in that chaotic situation. The man, observing the approaching enemies, calmly replied that this seemed to be a personal problem between them. Without hesitation, he prepared his small axe and began striking any enemy that appeared in front of him. Meanwhile, Vigo kept shouting, surprised that Jillian hadn't lost a bit of his sharpness. Jillian, as usual, wielded two different weapons, one in each hand, with unmatched mastery. He was absurdly skilled, using both weapons perfectly, whether with his right or left hand. Even so, the mercenaries kept advancing like flies, being brutally taken down one after another. Despite so many defeats, the mercenaries couldn't grasp the enormous gap in level that existed between them. From afar, Vigo noticed that his former captain still held that absurd strength, so he decided to execute his plan. He ordered his unit to split into two groups, trying to flank Jillian from both sides. Jillian had already predicted that exact movement. After all, he hadn't become captain of the Ratatosk by chance. Suddenly, he mounted his horse, surprising everyone, and immediately drew a new weapon. He grabbed a long-shafted spear, which had a sharp axe on each deadly end. Mounted, he charged at the enemies, swinging that weapon like a devastating, deadly rotor. That's why any mercenary had to master all kinds of weapons to survive in that cruel and hostile world. The mercenaries tried to surround the horse, searching for a blind spot, but they couldn't even get close. Jillian's weapon spun so fast it looked like a rotating blade capable of crushing bones. Even after taking down many, more enemies appeared, and one now attempted a surprise attack from above. However, Jillian wasn't caught off guard. He pulled out a sturdy shield, protecting himself with absolute efficiency and security. The attacker came in full force but was flawlessly blocked, crashing against the heavy shield. Vigo screamed that he would ruin Jillian's life, just like Jillian had destroyed his. Equipped with several blades between his fingers, Vigo vowed that he would get his revenge no matter what. He quickly threw several knives at the horse's neck, which felt the impact almost instantly. The animal couldn't withstand it and collapsed, forcing Jillian to leap at the last second to the ground. Vigo tried to take advantage, attacking with a short blade, but Jillian blocked in time, showing immense skill. With his shield, he delivered a strong blow, making it clear that he was no longer the Ratatosk captain. The declaration left Vigo completely unhinged, lost between shock and frustration at what he had heard. Realizing it wouldn't be easy, Vigo took a few steps back, evaluating the enemy more cautiously now. With a serious look, he asked that, if Jillian was no longer a captain, then who exactly had he become? Jillian, holding his weapon with intense aura, replied coldly that he had completely discarded that disgraceful past. Standing tall, he declared firmly that he was now just a loyal subordinate of Lord Ghislaine. Upon hearing that, Vigo became desperate. He never imagined receiving such a venomous and humiliating answer. Completely deranged, he launched himself recklessly at Jillian, determined to end it all at any cost. The battle between the two captains remained fierce, their blows tearing through the air violently. Neither accepted defeat, so they dug their feet into the ground, trying to hold firm. The captain of the Wildcats harbored deep resentment and bitterness toward that imposing man. He would never forgive the fact that this man had completely changed the course of his life. Meanwhile, the protagonist's new escort just watched everything, staying in absolute silence and alert. Attacks, blocks, and counterattacks followed, making that duel increasingly intense and impressive. Since that captain had been trained directly by Gillian, defeating him would be much harder than it seemed. The Wildcat had footwork that seemed almost supernatural, fast and absolutely precise. He circled his opponent, seeking an opening, constantly analyzing for a possible lapse in guard. At a certain point, the mercenary captain managed to block, but his shield shattered into pieces. Vigo then shouted that he had been trained to give his life for the Ratatos mercenaries. He said he couldn't understand how that man had abandoned everything to become a pawn of a pampered noble. Vigo's bloodthirsty gaze intensified as he said he could never forgive that former captain. With hatred in his eyes, he launched all three of his weapons at once, delivering his most powerful strike yet. But that great man was no beginner. He knew exactly how to control the movement of weapons. He masterfully redirected the projectiles, preventing any blade from even scratching his tough skin. However, all the Wildcat wanted was to force an opening in the enemy's guard. Realizing this, he quickly devised strategies and attempted bold maneuvers to finally create a fatal gap. But Gillian was also patiently waiting for that moment, looking to end the fight once and for all. The opponent was convinced that Gillian no longer held the same strength as before, so he believed that victory was only a matter of time and relentless pressure. However, as they fought, Gillian displayed highly technical, surprisingly strategic, and well-calculated moves. The captain of the Wildcats couldn't understand how someone so skilled had wasted time trying to heal a daughter. Knowing this, Vigo continued attacking relentlessly, certain that the man was no longer a match for him. With a swift movement, he retrieved his three weapons, finding the perfect opportunity to throw them again. However, he didn't know that his opponent wore a reinforced metal piece completely protecting his shoulders. Because of this, the blades failed to penetrate, but he realized that the enemy was searching for an opening. Attempting to surprise him, the leader of the Wildcats crawled forward and then spun, emerging from above. Sure that this would end the fight, he delivered a powerful and aggressively precise blow from above. What he didn't expect was that the man channeled so much mana, strengthening his hands absurdly. Gripping the blade with his bare hands, he asked if that revenge truly mattered so little. Upon realizing the immense amount of mana Gillian was using, he understood that he wasn't fighting seriously. It was at that very moment that he realized he was in trouble, about to be completely defeated. Gillian then countered brutally, throwing the Wildcat leader violently away, without any mercy. The leader of the Wildcats flew and was hurled forcefully, crashing into a tree. Dazed and struggling to get up, he faced the large man walking toward him. Holding one of the weapons thrown at him, Gillian asked why he had never sought revenge before. Vigo replied, saying there was something his former captain didn't know about the situation. He confessed that he had visited Gillian's house before, but had never found any Ratatos captain there. He told him that, at the time, he had only found a weak, miserable old man not worth confronting. That's why he was confused about where the man he had admired had disappeared for so many years. After hearing this story, Gillian fell silent, reflecting for a few seconds on everything he had heard. He then took a few steps back, threw the sword he had taken from his opponent to the ground. He raised his hand to his back, drew his own sword, and said it was a body bound to someone else's will, but at that moment, he would show his old comrade his respect. He solemnly raised his sword and declared that he would fight as the true captain of the Ratatos mercenaries. This declaration seemed to greatly please Vigo's ears, who was already preparing to attack. Now for the first time, they seemed to be speaking the same language, positioning themselves at the ideal distance for combat. Once again, the swords crossed, both relentlessly seeking the long-desired fatal opening. The Wildcats captain shouted with excitement, saying that this was exactly what he had always waited for. The blows were so fast that they could barely be followed, making the movements almost imperceptible. Between cuts, dodges, and defenses, the two were approaching a level that was absolutely near perfection. Both rigorously trained, with bodies shaped for war, they knew that this fight would not end easily. One of them would need to make a mistake, opening a fatal and final gap. Vigo then saw an opportunity, firmly believing that that strike would end everything with a brutal victory. However, his overconfidence led him to make a small slip, lowering his guard momentarily. In combat, such a slip means death, as a lowered guard signifies imminent defeat. Even after receiving a deep cut to his side, Vigo continued to fight fiercely, never giving up. Gillian, keeping his promise, warned that he would show no mercy, fighting as the captain of the Ratatos mercenaries. And in the instant he prepared the final strike, he declared that he would remember that commander. He respectfully called him commander of the 5th unit, looking him in the eye as an equal, in a sign of honor. Looking at the defeated man, he realized that despite everything, he had finally received the recognition he deserved. Vigo, even close to the end, smiled satisfied, as he'd have been acknowledged by the one he always wanted to be noticed by. Now only the defeated man lay on the ground, and the footprints of the victor were marked around him. As usual, Jillian bent down, took the weapon from the defeated man, and kept it as a trophy. He stood up, staring at the man who had once been part of the battalion he led. He then heard a voice from the carriage, praising him and saying that he had done a good job. Turning around, he saw it was Lord Ghislaine, accompanied by his servant Belinda, watching attentively. Belinda looked around and said that they could sell the weapons of the defeated to make some money. The man, bowing, apologized for delaying the journey more than planned. The protagonist looked closely at the man and realized that he was far more impressive than he had imagined. He recalled the stories he had heard about him in his childhood, when his feats were considered almost miraculous. Ghislaine, with his hands in his pockets, asked if the man knew exactly who that opponent was. Holding the defeated man's weapon, he firmly replied that he remembered perfectly who he was. He said that man had been an old comrade, a warrior who had been part of his story. Hearing this, Ghislaine reflected and wondered about the whereabouts of his other lost comrades. He imagined that probably they were still living their lives, as the time for reunion had not yet come. However, he decided that one day he would recruit them again, but for now he would focus on selling the weapons. 2 days later, they were already approaching the territory of Pertium, while the carriage moved forward calmly. Now they carried far more weapons than at the start of the journey, which clearly irritated Belinda. The protagonist, looking at the landscape through the carriage window, felt happy to be returning home. To the recently arrived man, however, it was just another city he would need to get used to. Ghislaine then directly asked the new member what he thought of those peculiar lands. The man replied politely that they were good, but the protagonist said he didn't need to lie to please him. After all, anyone could see the houses were old and any sign of renovation was far off. Jillian commented that he had heard those lands were constantly at war with the barbarians of the north. The protagonist replied that precisely because of that, he was determined to solve all these problems with his own strength. Looking at that rough and hostile scenery, no one knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The protagonist knew he had to protect everything connected to the Duke and preserve what he loved. The carriage then entered the lands of Pertium, following a calm and very familiar path. Belinda drew the protagonist's attention and asked him to look discreetly in a specific direction. Looking over, the young man widened his eyes, surprised to see someone he hadn't seen in a long time. By the silhouette, he immediately recognized it was his father, mounted on a fine horse with a serious expression. That imposing figure stood exactly in front of the main gates of Castle Pertium. As soon as they arrived, the protagonist was immediately brought inside the castle along with his father. They quickly met in the main hall, where an emergency meeting was already underway. Among critical matters, they discussed how Pertium's military power was fading at an alarming rate. They knew that, this time, they couldn't even count on any support from the Rayfold clan's troops. Listening closely, the young man realized the main topic was to rebuild the old Forest of Beasts army. He also noticed that the faces around that table were always the same as in all previous meetings. There was Ronald, the captain of the knights, a man with a stern expression, long hair, and a shining blue armor. Beside him sat Albert, the treasurer, a man with a thick beard, light hair, and extremely conservative clothes. Completing the table was Homer, the general administrator, a graying man with a thick mustache, small eyes, and an extremely controlled manner of speech. Although young as the Lord of Pertium, the protagonist carried decades of experience as king of the mercenaries. For that reason, he tried to integrate quickly into the conversation, attempting to show maturity and an understanding of current challenges. His father, Count Walter Pertium, watched him silently, always keeping the rigid expression typical of his imposing demeanor. The protagonist had never liked that stern and harsh man, although he was now beginning to understand his burdens. He was finally realizing how heavy it was to carry alone the responsibility that fell upon that vast territory. While sipping his tea, the Count directly questioned his son about the reason for his long absence. Without hesitation, the young man firmly replied that he had visited the Rayfold territory for important matters. The Count then showed a rare expression of satisfaction upon realizing that, this time, his son had caused no trouble. Albert, the treasurer, who never let go of his papers, remarked it was almost unbelievable that the young man had won a duel. Suspiciously, he asked if the boy had not just gone out to gamble again, as in previous occasions. The young man, smirking slightly, replied no, that he had actually resolved some pending business with Amelia. At that moment, Homer, the administrator, cleared his throat and reminded him that, as the future lord, he should start acting seriously. However, the Count thought that all this talk was enough and signaled that he wanted to end the meeting. But before that, he directly asked his son if it was true that he had executed Jamal and Phillips. He had heard rumors that the two had tried something against little Helina, and wanted confirmation. Just hearing those names gave the protagonist a lump in his throat, along with a fury ready to explode. Captain Ronald, suspicious, interrupted, saying he didn't believe the young man was capable of taking such an extreme measure. But the protagonist knew that, in truth, Ronald only wanted to avoid the truth, since both men were traitors. Without going into too much detail, the young man simply replied that they could say that was exactly what had happened. Hearing those words, Ronald breathed a sigh of relief, preferring to accept the half-truth than face the severity of the facts. The Count, however, clearly realized there was much more to that story, but praised his son for the result achieved. After all, what mattered were not the methods, but the fact that little Helina's life had been saved. Those words sounded like music to the protagonist's ears, for it was the first time he had ever received a compliment. Taking advantage of the rare moment, he then asked if he could make a request, looking directly into his father's eyes. Immediately, Homer intervened, crossing his arms, and warned that if it was money, he would throw the young man out. Ronald, for his part, agreed, recalling all the problems the young man had caused in the recent past. He listed everything from the illegal sale of soldier provisions to incidents in taverns and business conflicts. To everyone's surprise, the protagonist explained that his request didn't involve money, just a special authorization. Everyone in the room exchanged glances, curious, trying to imagine what kind of permission the audacious young man might be asking for. Then he stood up, looked into the eyes of each person present, and announced his request with firm resolve. He wanted to be the first to enter and explore the feared beast forest, a territory that had until then been untouched. After the meeting ended, he gathered his loyal subordinates and casually narrated how everything had happened. He told them that his father had flipped out, even going so far as to yell at Belinda, who promptly responded that she would do the same in his place. Soon after, he turned to Gillian and asked if he was truly aware of the entire plan that had been devised. The experienced and attentive man confirmed that he was, though he didn't think the idea was particularly sensible or prudent. After all, the forest was known as a place where no one who entered ever returned alive. Still, the protagonist was satisfied to know that Gillian was on board and ready for such a risky mission. Belinda, irritated, shouted that they couldn't just leave without formal permission from the Count, which they ignored. The young man responded that the request had been merely for courtesy, but his decision had already been made. Curious and suspicious, Belinda wanted to know what was in that place that made him want to take such a risk. However, the protagonist couldn't reveal it, as any leak of that information could bring extremely dangerous consequences. What he knew, in fact, was that at the entrance to the forest, there was an absurd amount of runestone. This mineral, deeply infused with mana, was highly valued by wizards, alchemists, and anyone practicing the arcane art. It was used in enchantments, magical barriers, teleportation scrolls, summoning circles, and a multitude of alchemical applications. He remembered very well that in his past life, it was the influential Duke Delphine who discovered that location. Now he possessed that privileged knowledge and, of course, intended to take advantage of it before anyone else did. Belinda, however, still couldn't understand the real reason, although she chose to overlook it, even though she was quite upset with it. Meanwhile, Gillian warned that hiring mercenaries might be a big mistake, as they were notoriously undisciplined. Still, the protagonist insisted, giving the veteran the task of selecting only the best among the available ones. Immediately, Gillian realized he was talking specifically about the feared mercenaries known as the Cerberus Mad Dogs. These men, though skilled, had a terrible reputation, famous for being violent, undisciplined, and treacherous. The protagonist, however, believed that as long as they were well paid, they could be extremely useful for this mission. They then decided to head to the Zimbar region, an area full of cliffs and dangerous roads, the territory of the Cerberus. From a distance, some of the mercenaries were already watching the two travelers approach, communicating the unexpected visit to the others. Looking through a binocular, one of them commented that, judging by their appearance, they seemed to be young nobles. However, before he could make any provocation, Gillian suddenly appeared, grabbed the binoculars, and seized the man by the neck. The man was completely terrified, struggling and demanding to be released, while his companions watched the scene, incredulous. Gillian squeezed his hand so tightly it seemed like he could crush the man right there effortlessly. He only released him when he chose to, tossing him back toward the group, who were now visibly shaken by the situation. The other mercenaries, who had been full of confidence, were now wondering who, in fact, those two people were. Amid the discomfort, a different figure then emerged, a man with a robust build and a clearly more refined appearance. Smiling cynically, he remarked that it seemed he had found a young lord and that this would bring some fun for them. However, as soon as his eyes met Ghislaine's, he immediately realized he had made a grave mistake. The smile disappeared instantly, replaced by a serious and distrustful expression as he observed the young man approaching calmly. Ghislaine, mounted on his white horse, showed no sign of fear or hesitation in front of that armed group. He then raised his hand, pointed directly at that man, and ordered firmly, without hesitation or doubt. He told him to call the captain immediately. Meanwhile, the enormous man stood still, holding a heavy weapon, just watching the protagonist closely. Still mounted on his white horse, the young man asked who, after all, their captain was. The brute didn't answer immediately, only letting out a small, muffled laugh, with no friendly expression. He then started swinging his heavy chain, implying the young noble had completely lost his mind. With each swing of the chain, his voice echoed, saying it was the perfect opportunity to teach responsibility. Without warning, he hurled that cruel weapon, a chain with a spiked ball at its tip. As the weapon was about to strike the young lord, he remained completely still, without any visible reaction. Suddenly, something stopped the chain's advance before it could even touch the protagonist, to everyone's surprise. The one responsible was Gillian, his escort, who would never allow such an affront to happen in his presence. Everyone watched as Gillian, with a simple motion, caught the chain with his sword, preventing any hostile approach. The spiked ball, which had been spinning through the air with brutal force, simply crashed to the ground with a thud. The protagonist knew perfectly well that in that place, words alone would have no practical effect on those wild mercenaries. That's why he looked at his bodyguard and asked him to go easy, but just enough to inspire fear. Without replying verbally, Gillian pulled the chain with his sword, dragging along the arm of the one holding it. Showing tremendous strength, he spun the man in the air as if he were just a sack of potatoes. As he was violently spun around, the mercenary screamed in desperation, begging to be released before fainting from dizziness. Still holding the chain, Gillian slammed the man hard against the ground, producing a chilling, dry sound. The most absurd part was that the brute's weapon now included not only the chain, but the man himself. With total coldness, Gillian swung the chain, flinging that man at anyone who dared to approach them at that moment. The other mercenaries who had shown courage earlier now hesitated, trembling, unsure whether to help or flee immediately. Though well-armed, wearing armor, and equipped with swords and shields, none of them seemed willing to face that monster. Tired of the charade, the protagonist dismounted his horse and walked steadily to Gillian's side. Facing the group, he crossed his arms and asked how much longer they intended to keep him waiting. His blue eyes scanned each face present, demanding they immediately summon the captain of that cowardly and noisy band. Under pressure, one of the men ran to a tent, saying the chief was sleeping deeply. A few minutes later, all the mercenaries lined up, holding their spears, finally adopting a minimally professional and respectful stance. The captain stepped forward with firm steps, announcing himself as Kara, leader of the Cerberus mercenaries, that feared group. Kara was a light-skinned man with messy red hair and a robust build, flaunting muscles that looked hand-sculpted. He raised an eyebrow, crossed his arms, and asked directly what the reason was for that sudden visit. Without patience, the protagonist shot back, asking if the man really thought he had come to play at fighting games. Kara, irritated, commented that even a noble should learn a bit more about manners and respect. Ghislaine smirked and replied that this was, in fact, his polite way of greeting important people. Laughing sarcastically, Kara said that if that was politeness, he feared to know what rudeness looked like. With tempers more controlled, both sat inside the main tent, where they could finally discuss important matters. The protagonist was direct, making it clear that he wanted to hire the group to explore the dreaded forest of beasts. Upon hearing this, some of the guards present began murmuring, visibly uncomfortable, afraid to even talk about that cursed place. Kara narrowed his eyes, crossed his arms, and asked what kind of lunatic would propose something like that. The young lord then formally introduced himself, proudly stating that his name was Ghislaine Pertium, Lord of Pertium. As soon as they heard that name, all the soldiers burst into laughter, thinking he was just the young man from the rumors. In that moment, all the respect he had earned from the initial clash vanished like smoke in the wind. Kara then stood up, kicked the chair, crossed his arms, and said the negotiation was officially over. He ordered his men to expel the two of them immediately, saying he wouldn't waste time with boys playing at warlords. Unshaken, Gillian gripped his weapon firmly, ready to defend his young master, while Ghislaine remained calmly seated. With a sharp gaze, the protagonist asked if the captain was afraid of entering the forest, by any chance. Staring straight at him, he added, was everything he had heard about the Cerberus skills nothing but lies? Kara, feeling challenged, propped his feet up on the table, laughing, saying he didn't accept being mocked. He reminded them that as mercenaries, they weren't obligated to accept any job, much less take orders from spoiled youths. Ghislaine, provoking him further, replied that it was typical of cowards to make up lame excuses to hide their own fear. Kara's smile vanished immediately, replaced by a stern expression, clearly displeased with the direct affront. He sighed, looked up at the ceiling of the tent, and commented that, at this point, it wasn't even worth killing him. The young man crossed his legs, closed his eyes, and declared that he wouldn't leave without what he came for. It was then that, staring directly at Kara, he pronounced a sentence that left everyone speechless, including the experienced Gillian. "I demand a Moriana recognition," he declared, his voice firm, without showing any sign of hesitation. As soon as they heard this, everyone in the tent froze completely, staring at him as if they had seen a ghost appear. Even Gillian, accustomed to his master's absurdities, had no idea how he knew about that secret tradition. Care, with a mix of surprise and disbelief, asked if Ghislaine truly understood the weight of what he had just asked. Raising an eyebrow, Ghislaine replied that not only did he understand, but he demanded it to happen immediately, no more delays. The Moriana recognition was a traditional duel between mercenaries, done with hands bound and very specific rules. Each opponent held a small dagger without infusing mana, and the combat took place inside a delineated circle. If anyone stepped outside the circle, they would automatically be declared the loser, with no right to appeal. However, the most curious part was that the loser didn't just surrender, they had to swear total obedience to the winner. Kerr, laughing, commented that basically, the loser became the other's lapdog, having to follow their orders blindly. Gillian silently wondered mentally how, in the name of the heavens, his young master knew such a specific tradition. However, to refuse it would automatically mean cowardice, and no mercenary with honor would accept carrying that stigma for the rest of their life. Given this, Kerr laughed loudly, stood up, and shouted to the men to prepare everything, as the duel would take place right there. Both had their arms tied to each other, positioned within the circle, each holding a simple dagger. The mercenaries shouted, cheering for their leader, wishing for him to crush that spoiled boy and end the nonsense. Kerr, suspicious, commented that the boy must have heard about this somewhere and was now blatantly bluffing. Pulling Ghislaine's arm, he whispered in his ear that he had already done that recognition 5 times and won every time. Ghislaine, smiling almost demonically, returned the pull, getting closer to the redhead's ear, and responded in a dark tone. 5? Funny, because he's done this more than 100 times in my entire life. At that moment, Kerr realized that, for the first time, he had accepted a duel where he had no idea who he was facing. After hearing those words from the protagonist, that man no longer showed such confidence. With that, both quickly pointed their weapons, aiming at each other without hesitation. The skill of both seemed very similar at first, as they both managed to dodge attacks at the exact same time. However, they avoided each other, staring firmly at one another, knowing this wouldn't be easy. They knew that the next strike would truly count, as the initial one was just a test. Thus began something frantic, where each blow was thrown in an attempt to destabilize the opponent. That recognition was something out of the ordinary, where both pulled each other, trying to avoid hits. Even at a disadvantage, the protagonist moved fiercely, showing extreme experience and absolute control of his body. He truly displayed all the experience accumulated from over 100 times in this type of combat. However, they continued fighting without landing any truly impactful blows on the opponent. The protagonist noticed when the rival made a strange movement with his feet, something suspicious. Immediately, he tried to avoid the blow, using his own leg as defense against the movement. When doing so, he clearly noticed another strange movement the man made at that moment. Kerr, looking directly at him, said that he had hoped the protagonist would last much less. Seeing that precise movement, he believed that the man had truly done many recognitions before, but he refused to believe it was more than 100, thinking that statement was a lie. With that, he charged forward, determined to end the duel immediately. The atmosphere was filled with shouts, the mercenaries desperately cheering for their captain to emerge victorious. However, every time the captain looked directly at them, they lost some of that spontaneous excitement. In the middle of the crowd, Gillian realized by himself that this was already a completely lost battle. The arena was small enough that any imbalance would cause someone to fall to the ground. Additionally, the rule of not using mana forced both to fight using pure strength. The intertwined arms drastically limited movement freedom, making everything much more exhausting and risky. He clearly noticed that his young master could barely dodge, block, and attack in the same sequence. Watching from a distance, Gillian believed the opponent had total control and was dominating the fight. He thought that if the situation worsened further, he would intervene to protect his young master. At one point, to avoid a heavier blow, the protagonist ended up in a bad position. As a result, he was thrown up, and the opponent tried to use that to throw him. However, this didn't happen, as the protagonist managed to adjust his body and land back on his feet. Even so, Ghislaine noticed he was starting to feel pain exactly in the spot where he had blocked earlier. He knew the damage was much greater due to the absence of mana that normally protected against impacts. The opponent was smiling, believing the protagonist was already pale and clearly close to his limit. As he attacked, the redhead thought the man was just being stubborn and resisting pointlessly. He watched with sarcasm, convinced he could easily predict every move about to be made. He thought the protagonist's strategy was simple, just deflect or block, nothing more. He also noticed how many times his rival blocked the attacks directly with his body, with no alternative. He knew very well that without mana, every impact was felt fully and cruelly. The protagonist also realized that the opponent had already noticed his growing difficulty, especially in his legs. With a smirk, the opponent seemed to enjoy watching his rival's suffering. To him, that look of pain was what made the fight truly satisfying. He then began making a few movements with his blade, preparing for the next decisive strike. Even attacking at full strength, the redhead still couldn't bring down the determined young lord. The fight continued in the same way as it had from the start, with no clear advantage for either side. The protagonist kept blocking, resisting, and standing, refusing to fall before that opponent. At one point, their armed arms crossed, and the protagonist understood the rival's intention. He clearly saw that the man was once again preparing to use his knee as an offensive weapon. Aware of that, he positioned his already aching leg once more, knowing it would serve as a shield. Each time he did that, the pain increased terribly, but he knew it was necessary. The redhead, with a tone of disdain, said that was enough, and there would be no more chances. He raised his weapon differently, ready to end the sparring session once and for all without further delay. Everyone present already knew the conclusion was near, and it now seemed completely inevitable. In response, Jillian discreetly drew the weapon on his back, prepared to intervene without hesitation. However, the blonde young man gave a faint smile, realizing that a worthy clash was finally about to begin. When the redhead attempted a simple strike, he failed so disastrously that it shocked everyone. For the first time, he left a grotesque opening, something that should never have happened in that moment. He glanced sideways as he saw the protagonist dodge a blow that no one had ever avoided before. With that movement, the protagonist practically redrew the entire circle, stepping completely outside the planned route. Thus, he managed to strike the redhead directly on the side, hitting his unprotected rib. The man could hardly believe he had actually been hit, and everyone was completely stunned. Even Gillian was as shocked as the mercenaries who had been watching everything unfold. Now the redhead could no longer make a single mistake. Every move had to be executed with perfection. But driven by rage, his senses were much weaker, making him even more vulnerable to mistakes. That was exactly what the protagonist wanted, to destabilize, break his mental focus, and force him to slip. All the men present grew tense, as the young lord had managed to seriously wound their captain. Still, many believed the captain was just playing around, and wasn't taking it seriously yet. However, every strike now launched by the protagonist was precise, each one aimed directly at the redhead. He began striking him with violent elbow blows to the neck, the mouth, and the face. Still gripping the dagger tightly, the protagonist refused to use it to stab in lethal spots. He preferred to land several punches on the man's face before preparing a strike with the blade. He then drove the dagger into the redhead's arm without hesitation, making his calculated intention clear. As expected, the pain sent the man into a complete frenzy, losing all emotional control. He couldn't understand how the boy, who had been struggling just minutes before, had suddenly become so cold and relentless. Meanwhile, the protagonist calmly watched the hatred-filled expression on his opponent's face. It took time, but Gillian finally understood exactly what strategy his master had adopted. The young lord tensed his muscles, overburdened his joints, and forced his body to endure. In addition, he let the opponent take control of the force so that he could later redirect its weight. That way, he was no longer fighting the attacks, but instead controlling the entire rhythm. Once he established his own rhythm, he began landing a series of successive, precise blows. Seeing this, Jillian breathed a sigh of relief and put his weapon away, realizing he no longer needed to intervene. The other mercenaries shouted in desperation, begging their captain to fight back. They were about to become a joke. The protagonist, however, stared firmly at that man, recognizing that his resilience was truly admirable. He stated that any other enemy would have already broken the rules to escape such a desperate situation. The redhead smiled, admitting that for the first time, it seemed the protagonist had truly done everything. He said that anyone who became captain through recognition knew they could never break the rules they were meant to uphold. The protagonist enjoyed hearing that, especially coming from the redhead, who now admitted to being at a disadvantage. He then realized that simply overwhelming the enemy wasn't enough anymore, as there was a second fundamental condition. The redhead began to exert excessive force on their intertwined arms, aiming to force the other to fall. He intended to win using the rule that whoever stepped out of the circle would be automatically defeated. He believed that no matter how skilled the protagonist was, it would only take a step outside, and he would immediately lose. Victory seemed practically certain. All that was left was to wait until the young lord stepped out. However, at the critical moment, the protagonist moved his body in a strange way, something never seen before. He flexed his weight, redirected his force, and managed to return to the circle by using the redhead. To reinforce this, he delivered a kick to the redhead's leg, forcing him backward and pulling him along. Since they were tied by a rope, if one fell, the other would inevitably be dragged too. The protagonist's plan worked perfectly, repositioning him within the circle and regaining full control of the fight. He showed that only someone who had done more than 100 recognitions would know how to execute such a maneuver. He finished by slamming the redhead's face into the ground, exactly outside the line of the circle. As a result, the opponent's head touched the ground outside the line, securing the victory. All the mercenaries watched in shock, realizing that their captain had lost in a completely humiliating and sudden way. That man, who had been so close to victory, lost everything in a matter of seconds. The protagonist looked down and clearly declared what everyone there already knew. He had defeated the captain, and there was absolutely nothing they could say to contradict that. The redhead, not understanding, wanted to know who that man was, capable of performing such feats. Looking serious, the protagonist responded that he didn't like his attitude and demanded more respect. He then gave a sharp pull on the man's arm, forcing him to stand while still speaking. The redhead responded that the fight was over and that there was no need to continue. The protagonist, however, smiled and replied, "No, you haven't stepped out of the circle yet." And, preparing a punch, he warned that now he would personally teach that subordinate good manners. Thus, after gearing up for the punch, he needed to teach a lesson to his new subordinate. And so, once again, that man fell with his face projected outside the circle. The redhead put his hands in front of his face, trying to protect himself, while desperately screaming. The rule was as clear as day: he couldn't step outside the circle. However, this only earned him another lesson, taking another hit squarely in the face. The protagonist then asked if he intended to follow the rules on the battlefield as well. While saying this, he applied a few more well-placed lessons to that already battered face. When the redhead tried to respond, the protagonist told him to shut up immediately. After all, he hadn't given permission for the subordinate to speak at that moment. Before the man could say he was a lunatic, he got another dose of discipline. The young lord seemed to have gained quite a liking for educating that man in a rather forceful manner. The other mercenaries didn't even know if it was right to let him keep punching their leader. When the redhead's face became incredibly swollen, he screamed desperately, begging for him to stop. He said he didn't want any more education, as he had already learned everything necessary. However, once again, the protagonist yanked the man back into the circle without any mercy. Rearming his fist once more, he warned that the man wasn't completely done yet. Now it seemed that the redhead had finally understood exactly what he was trying to convey. He shouted, looking at his men, asking if they intended to watch this in silence. The mercenaries tried to muster the courage to help their leader in this completely disproportionate massacre. However, they were immediately discouraged by Gillian, who was holding his small axe threateningly. With a terrifying aura, Gillian made it clear that anyone who interfered would be crushed immediately. Given this, everyone understood that it would be far wiser to wait for the Lord to finish his lesson. The redhead, realizing that no one would dare intervene, now found himself in an extremely complicated situation. His face was absurdly marked by the long minutes of discipline he had received up until that point. The protagonist looked directly into the redhead's eyes and asked if he had finished his drama. He then adjusted his clenched fist again, signaling that the lesson was not over yet. He educated the redhead once more, until he understood that not all nobles were the same. Unlike the nobles he knew, this one was not a useless, puffed-up figure, nor was he a cruel narcissist, one of those who paid mercenaries just to inflate their own egos. It was exactly for this reason that the redhead earned the infamous title of Mad Dog over the years. However, at that very moment, he was clearly losing to a brat with a heavier fist. A nobleman was training him to exhaustion, gripping his arm tightly without mercy. The surrounding mercenaries looked on with concern, thinking that if it continued, their leader might die. The protagonist, staring at the man, wondered whether that was enough or not. He quickly glanced at the surrounding mercenaries and asked what exactly they were waiting for. He said they should immediately fetch water, bandages, and a towel before the captain passed out. Everyone understood that the lesson was over and could finally intervene without fear. At the entrance of the location, a wooden sign clearly displayed the symbol of the Cerberus group. While all this was happening, Gillian simply observed and reflected on how enigmatic that man was. It was strange to see unruly mercenaries obeying the orders of a young lord so naturally. Meanwhile, the protagonist insisted that they carry water, fetch towels, and bring the bandages. The redhead knew that in the mercenary world, where the fist ruled, something had changed. That young lord had shown who was truly in charge, turning the mad dog into a loyal pup. When the redhead recovered a bit, he saw the protagonist placing a contract on the table. The young lord pointed precisely where he should sign, with ink and quill already prepared. The redhead, his face completely swollen, looked at him with a somewhat saddened expression. Reluctantly, he took the quill and signed at the indicated spot without any objections. As soon as he finished, he muttered in a deep voice, ironically calling the protagonist "sweetie" without thinking. The young lord's expression instantly hardened, and he seriously asked what he had just said. Fearing another round of education, the redhead quickly retracted and said it would be a pleasure. He said he would be very happy to work alongside him from that moment on without issue. When the protagonist grabbed the redhead's arm again, he feared more punches to the face. However, the young lord merely said that from now on, they were part of the same family, like brothers. He also said he hoped to get along very well working with the redhead from then on. After that agreement, a few days passed, and the surroundings of the territory of Pertium became busy. Soldiers were on standby, chatting casually, not understanding why they had been summoned so early. Some yawned, having no idea why they had been called to that place early in the morning. Rumor had it that the one who hired them was the young lord responsible for those lands. They thought it would be an easy job since the boy seemed completely harmless. Suddenly, a muscular man clapped his hands, asking everyone to pay close attention to him. That was Gordon the Muscle, as everyone knew him, always standing out in a crowd. He said that to deal with that brat, they needed to choose a representative to make demands. He volunteered himself, as he had perfect posture and knew how to negotiate with nobles. He explained that if they didn't unite their voices, they wouldn't get everything they wanted there. His speech seemed to convince the others, who agreed to let Gordon be their spokesperson. A bald man beside him looked suspicious and asked exactly what Gordon planned to do. He replied that he intended to pressure the boy, demanding extra compensation for the job. He said everyone should start putting money into the pouch, reinforcing his role as their representative. As they argued, they noticed someone approaching, so they quickly composed themselves and adjusted their postures. From afar, they clearly saw someone riding a white horse coming in their direction. They soon realized it was the young lord of the territory of Pertium, exactly who they had been waiting for. Judging by the clothes, they were sure that was their employer, even though he was completely alone. Gordon, with all his flair, told everyone to put on mean faces to intimidate the boy. He truly believed he was about to teach the brat how things worked in the real world. However, his eyes caught something that made his spine freeze and his hands start to sweat. That young lord was not alone. Several renowned mercenaries began appearing behind him. Among them was the feared captain of the mercenaries and, of course, the infamous mad dog Cerberus. Someone in the group immediately recognized the helmet shape. It was the Cerberus mercenaries. The redhead and his men walked silently, heads down, not daring to say a word. When the protagonist finally arrived, he noticed the reception was quite different from what Gordon had imagined. The young lord looked at everyone, clearly seeing they were now terrifyingly obedient. Then he turned to the big man and asked calmly if he was the representative. The muscular man, trembling, lowered his head and answered almost voicelessly that yes, his name was Gordon. Sweating cold as he said his own name, he remembered he had planned to teach the boy a lesson. Demonstrating all his diplomacy, the protagonist gave a light pat on the big man's arm. He introduced himself formally as the young lord of the territory of Pertium, stating his name with firmness. Upon hearing this, the mercenaries' faces immediately became saddened, realizing their huge mistake. Turning his back, the protagonist ordered Gordon to gather all the mercenaries and follow him immediately. He then informed them, in a serious tone, that they would soon begin the exploration mission in the Beast Forest. Near the Beast Forest, many tents had been set up to shelter the soldiers. The protagonist knew that the preparations were almost complete to finally explore that hostile and dangerous environment. Meanwhile, he observed his loyal servant Belinda, who treated him with kindness, care, and affection. She helped him put on each piece of protection, adjusting armor, belts, and various strategic accessories. He reflected that he already had a temporary base set up, search resources, and a considerable troop. When referring to the troop, he meant those mercenaries who were now officially under his command. Fully trusting Belinda, he asked her to do one more count to confirm the number. She quickly looked, adding the 148 mercenaries hired for the Cerberus group. With the 41 mercenaries brought by the protagonist himself, the total was 192 fighters. Looking at her, he asked if she had informed the commander of the troops about all these details. Belinda replied that yes, although she initially thought he would oppose the entry into the forest. However, they assured that they wouldn't be seen, as they would enter discreetly, avoiding issues with the local territorial guards. With that, the protagonist felt excited, as everything was going exactly as planned up to that point. He soon caught the attention of all the mercenaries, asking them to pay close attention to his words. With his thumb pointing backward, he informed them that the destination would be the dreaded Beast Forest. He warned of the countless monsters, the unknown threats, and the hidden dangers in that dark and treacherous environment. Many looked visibly worried, as that place was known to be a true and terrifying monster den. When they began interrupting his speech, Belinda immediately became irritated, extremely displeased with that clear lack of respect. The protagonist then made it clear that, if they wished, they could leave without any problem. However, if the mission succeeded, he would pay 3 times more than originally agreed. As soon as they heard this exorbitant offer, everyone changed their minds and decided to stay on the mission immediately. Despite this, Belinda quietly approached and whispered in the young lord's ear, asking if he had gone mad. He calmly replied that if everything went well, he would have enough funds to pay everyone without difficulty. He then looked her in the eyes and directly asked if she truly trusted his decisions. Belinda took a deep breath and replied that she had no choice, but she would trust him once again, as she always had. The redhead also thought that the Lord was completely insane, offering absurd sums without thinking of the consequences. On the other hand, Jillian knew his boss well and understood that he always had a secret card. The protagonist stepped ahead of everyone and ordered the mercenaries to follow him immediately. Soon, the first steps were taken towards the dark forest, a place whose aura was simply oppressive. Upon entering, they began to fell several trees to create tents, shelters, and storage spaces for supplies. The devastation quickly advanced, allowing them to clear paths and protect themselves from the imminent dangers of that hostile region. They felled numerous ancient trees, probably standing there for centuries, resisting time. The protagonist felt satisfied, especially seeing the sky's light cutting through the newly open spaces in the forest. Immediately, he ordered them to continue felling trees exactly in the direction he was pointing with complete conviction. He instructed that the trees be cut in an aligned manner, turning that space into a true strategic path. He also ordered that they dig around the roots to make removal less physically demanding. He reflected that he had learned these techniques in his past life when he studied extensively about mining and territorial expansion. He knew that the place was vast and that, one day, they would expel all the monsters from there forever. He thought that the more resources he extracted, the greater the expansion of the expedition would be, frustrating the conspiracy against his family. The redhead looked to the side and realized that even the boss was working as hard as everyone else. The mercenaries commented that he was doing this to appear as a worthy leader, even though he was a noble. When Belinda heard these malicious gossip, she became furious and firmly ordered everyone to get back to work. She kept a close eye on who was speaking ill of the young lord, mentally noting who would need to be reprimanded later. She decided to personally confront those who murmured, saying that if he was working, everyone should do the same. She loudly declared that the more hands helping, the faster they would finish the entire forest. She remarked to herself that he spoke as if he had already lived that situation before, which was curious. Thus, she stayed by his side, ready to prevent anything bad from happening suddenly. Once again, the redhead didn't miss the chance to mock, saying it was all just Belinda's jealousy. In a moment of distraction, Jillian turned around and accidentally hit the redhead's back with a piece of tree trunk. The redhead immediately realized it had been on purpose and asked if the big guy really wanted to fight. The protagonist, watching that comedic scene, reflected that, up to that moment, everything was going exactly as he had planned. He knew that, in the past, Duke Delphin had conquered the entire kingdom and established a powerful dynasty that had been possible thanks to the mineral wealth, natural resources, and control of the beasts in that forgotten forest. He now had the chance to repeat that feat, unleashing a planned devastation and even using special lanterns. Despite that, he found it odd that nothing had gone wrong yet, which made him suspicious and on high alert. Even after reading many records and newspapers in his previous life, he had never personally witnessed what was about to come. He knew he couldn't let his guard down, as they were about to enter the depths of a dark forest. As they advanced, they kept cutting down trees, clearing the way, unaware of the hidden horrors they were about to awaken. The mercenaries started commenting that the job seemed too easy, and that maybe the rumors had been exaggerated. The bold, bald man, full of himself, kicked Gordon's back, saying he wanted his money back. However, Gordon noticed something strange that no one else seemed to have realized, so he immediately called everyone's attention. He asked if they had cut several trees up to that point, which everyone confirmed without hesitation. Then he looked back and nervously asked why the path they had cleared was completely blocked again. Everyone began to realize, terrified, that the cut trees had regenerated, completely sealing off the way out. At that moment, the protagonist shouted, ordering everyone to pay maximum attention, as they were clearly in an ambush. The atmosphere, which had seemed calm before, grew heavy and tense, leaving everyone visibly nervous and wary. Immediately, the protagonist called Gordon, asking him to move away from that tree, or he would die right there. He told him to walk slowly, without sudden movements, taking just one careful step at a time. However, for a man Gordon's size, moving so cautiously was nearly impossible. Clumsily, he ended up bumping the tree trunk with a piece of wood he was still carrying on his shoulder. The wood fell with a loud thud, and at that instant, everyone realized that something terrible was about to happen. The mercenaries were shocked, as that noise seemed to have awakened something evil hidden in those trees. The big man looked to the side and was completely terrified to see the tree growing in an abnormal way. It seemed to be walking slowly, moving its roots like legs, approaching him with an absolutely terrifying and suffocating presence. Everyone began to notice that there was something very strange and supernatural happening with that specific tree. Meanwhile, the protagonist, arms crossed, simply watched from a distance, curious to see how it would end. The bald man tried to defuse the situation, laughing, saying their boss was scared just because he was a noble. He calmly pointed toward Gordon, trying to prove that nothing was happening, that it was just superstition. However, the protagonist remained serious, stating that if they didn't leave slowly, everyone would die soon. The bald man mocked, saying that young lord was making things up just to scare the mercenaries for no reason. Suddenly, something from the tree stretched out quickly, grabbing the bald man as if it were a magical vine. The vine wrapped around his waist, yanking him violently while he screamed in terror, begging for help. Everyone was stunned, as no one could do anything at all. He had wasted too much time mocking and standing still. The tree slowly opened a massive mouth, revealing 2 rows of sharp teeth, ready to devour that poor soul. It was simply horrifying to see that creature, with huge, hungry eyes, staring at its prey and about to devour it whole. The protagonist, watching closely, realized that it wasn't a simple tree, but a terrifying monster named Iris. Even after witnessing what had happened, the protagonist didn't have enough time to react. When the monsters emerged, everyone started shouting that they had to flee immediately. However, after having cleared the forest all day, now was the time when the trees would strike back. Huge monsters with enormous eyes appeared and used their branches to lash out at people. The forest, ordinary during the day, seemed to come alive at night and began to hunt everyone there. With mouths full of multiple rows of teeth, they used ropes to capture people and carry them off as food. After putting them into their enormous mouths, they simply shut them and completed the chewing. Among those chained by those ropes was the large Gordon, who screamed while holding onto another tree. Meanwhile, someone else tried to cut the vine wrapped around his body with an axe. The material proved to be immensely resistant. Not even iron weapons were capable of cutting it. One of the mercenaries witnessed this difficulty while trying to cut one of the vines. Now he looked at Gordon and knew that he was lost. He would be devoured just like the others. When Gordon was pulled to be consumed by the tree, everyone realized that his end would be the same. At that moment, the protagonist had to react and therefore concentrated mana in his sword. Only then was he able to cut the vine that held the large man by the waist. Luckily, the protagonist knew exactly what to do and saved him before something worse could happen. Also using mana, he launched a strike toward the tree's large eye. With that, the creature calmed down a bit and threw the man to the ground. They shouted that since he had cut the tree, perhaps the weak spot was the eye. Because of that, the protagonist became furious when he realized that no one noticed that he was the one who actually did it. The shouts warned that everyone should remain alert. Lowering their guard at that moment would be asking to die. He warned that if panic continued, everyone would become easy targets. They should raise their shields and form a line. First, they should focus only on defense until he gave the order to attack. The shields had to block the vines when they approached to lash out. At that moment, he reached the redhead and asked for the lanterns before it was too late. He requested that they walk with the lanterns to attack the monsters and burn them. The redhead understood why the man had brought so many lanterns to that location. The trees could move, and everyone shouted that they were already approaching. The protagonist shouted that everyone should attack all at once without wasting time. They should throw a lantern into the mouths of all those large trees. As the lanterns were thrown, the trees struggled to block them all. The redhead noticed that the trees swallowed most of the lanterns, and everyone watched to see if there would be a reaction. Barbie, with her enormous eyes, began to tremble. It seemed that the fire from the lanterns was weakening them. Quickly, Jillian, with his weapon imbued with mana, began to cut the branches. Belinda also imbued her weapons with mana and helped in the battle. She threw spears directly into the tree's large eyes, protecting herself and the young lord. The protagonist asked the two to prepare to throw the lanterns while protecting the barbarian mercenaries. He explained that he would attract all the monsters' attention to himself, holding his large sword. However, the young woman couldn't see her lord advancing toward the monsters and staying calm. When he swung his sword, she shouted for him to be very careful. However, he was alert to everything and knew exactly which cuts to make. While fighting, he managed to draw the attention of all the monsters to himself, keeping the mercenaries safe. He swung his sword between one monster and another so that everyone would keep their attention solely on him. Thus, the lanterns began to be thrown toward the monsters. The mercenaries didn't understand that, despite looking like trees, the monsters had legs. Seeing the protagonist fight those tree monsters, everyone found it hard to believe. Even so, he had a considerable advantage over those monsters. He managed to pierce one of their eyes when it tried to approach quickly. In no time, the protagonist was surrounded by several tree monsters. Some mercenaries just watched and protected themselves behind their shield. Then came Belinda's order. It was time for everyone to throw their lanterns. Following the young woman's orders, they all threw the lanterns at the same time. The damage had to be significant, as all the trees opened their mouths to devour the protagonist. However, when they swallowed the lanterns, a reaction began to flow in their bodies. This reaction pleased the mad dog and some Cerberus mercenaries. The protagonist asked them not to laugh unnecessarily, as they needed to continue and never stop. So everyone started setting the tree monsters on fire to burn them. They called for all the troops to advance, and this was done quickly. All of them began to catch fire. The mercenaries found it incredible, and had never thought it possible to fight against tree monsters. However, everyone feared the entire forest at that scale of fire. Gordon believed it made sense that the trees were fragile to fire, as they were made of wood. The protagonist ordered that no one lower their guard, as the fight was not over yet. He told everyone that now the trees would show their true appearance. Suddenly, a huge cloud of dust began to emanate from the area. They felt the smoke form a fog, but the fire had already been extinguished. While Belinda and Gillian were near the protagonist, everyone called for him seeking help. At one point, Belinda asked the protagonist what was happening. He explained that the inside of the trees was vulnerable to fire, but it hadn't been the fire that burned them from the inside. There had been contact with something strong, which is why the smoke rose. Once it dissipated, everyone would see what they really were. Huge monsters with star-shaped appearances, tentacles, and countless rows of teeth emerged. They looked like monstrous flowers, and everyone admired their resilience, even against fire. Now everyone was apprehensive and looked to the protagonist for a way to protect themselves. Raising his sword, he asked everyone to lift their weapons, for the real battle was about to begin. For that reason, he was the first to walk toward those monstrosities. He warned everyone that from that point on, it would be close combat, and they needed to keep their guards up. He told them to understand that it would be all or nothing, then charged into battle against them. Even their big guy, the fat one, found it difficult to fight hand-to-hand against those monsters. The first to follow the protagonist were the Cerberus mercenaries, led by the Mad Dog. After that, young Belinda, worried about the young lord, also moved toward him. Gillian had to take the lead and ask the other mercenaries what they were waiting for. It was an order given by the young lord, and they should obey it immediately. That large man made it clear they should entrust their lives to the Lord. With that, they realized there was no other way. If they didn't fight, they would perish. They had to believe the young lord would find a way. The protagonist told them they could cut down the monsters even without using mana. After saying that, the order was to cut down everything that moved. Belinda and Gillian were the first to follow that order, so they stepped forward right away. Thus, everyone followed the protagonist and managed to defeat the monsters with ease. He knew that hesitation in that place was a walking disaster. His role there was to eliminate the hesitation of those who followed his orders, so he always took the first step. He managed to shove his sword inside the mouth of one of those monsters, proving it wasn't hard to defeat them. His precise strike drove the sword through and sliced in half whatever was moving. He knew that by doing so, he showed everyone that it was possible to make the impossible come true by his side. He was the first to completely bring down one of those monsters and prove it was possible. Now, the mercenaries realized that worse than the trees was that protagonist. However, the young lord warned them not to lower their guard at any moment, as more monsters could appear. It was no coincidence that the forest was called the Beast Forest. They were only at its entrance. That motivational speech left many mercenaries terrified just imagining what awaited deeper inside. Even so, the protagonist asked them not to fear anything and that, if they stayed on guard, everything would be fine. After all, he would always be at the front protecting them, and so he turned for everyone to see his face. He spoke firmly, telling them to trust and follow him, because with him, none of them would fall. At first, everyone was a bit hesitant, unsure whether they should trust a noble. Then their voices echoed through that forest, and everyone wanted to help. He called on all of them to be part of his plan to conquer that forest. They should cut down as many trees as possible during the day. When night fell, everyone fought fiercely against incredible monsters. Even a band of orcs appeared out of nowhere to fight them. Belinda found time to tend to a few minor injuries the protagonist had sustained. Several bizarre monsters emerged during the night, and everyone had to keep their guard up. They had already gone through numerous situations, including animals that looked like genetic mutations. Monsters they never imagined could exist. That bestial forest held countless secrets. But the Mad Dog, Gillian, and the protagonist stood at the front and showed everyone it was possible to win. Even when the monsters were incredibly large and ferocious, capable of devouring them in a single bite. Still, there was always a way. Gillian was shielding himself from one of their bites with his shield. Meanwhile, the protagonist was plunging his sword into as many beasts as he could, and he always kept count of the mercenaries, checking whether everyone was alright. Over time, they learned that to survive, they had to protect the leader's blind spots. At one point, the protagonist, the Mad Dog, and the mercenary captain observed how much progress they had made. Even so, they still had a long way to go. Even among the brave, there was always someone who didn't believe in themselves. It was no different here. There was a mercenary soldier who thought they were all crazy for being trapped in that place. At night, the bestial forest became completely different and was a hard place to rest. Soon, the protagonist spotted a large lake. They arrived with their mercenaries and now had to hydrate. Several of them started drinking the water, which was completely clear. Belinda thought it was dangerous, as no one knew where the water came from or where it went. While the protagonist just watched, he noticed they had made good progress up to that point. They decided to set up camp near that area of the lake to take a brief break. As they gathered around a meal, Everyone was tired, but they knew there was still a long way to go. So much so that one mercenary planted an idea in everyone's head. They wanted to escape. That man said they no longer needed to risk their lives for this. He tried to convince everyone that their lives were worth more than just a pile of money. The man did everything he could to gather more people to flee with him, as he was afraid to go alone. Some refused as they had already been paid and were supposed to fulfill their roles as good mercenaries. The man admitted that the leader knew how to handle a sword well, but how long could they rely on luck? He said it was more than clear that the boss would use them as shields when everything went wrong. Everyone was planning to listen to him until the end, as it seemed like he had a plan. The man thought it was working, as everyone was now afraid. Leaving alone was dangerous. However, if someone asked the man what he had just said, that they were alive only because of the leader. He counted on his fingers and showed the leader, who was tending to the wounded despite being tired. The protagonist, with a jar in hand, was applying a liquid that was a form of medication. He said that the person should ensure the water did not touch the wound, as it would become infected. Meanwhile, Belinda was talking to the young master, explaining that all those medicines were expensive. The protagonist continued doing his good work as the leader of the expedition. With that, the mercenary who wore an eye patch concluded that someone like that wouldn't abandon them. Everyone stood by that leader and believed he was incapable of leaving them to fend for themselves. The man knew who was ruining his plan. It was the man with the eye patch. The protagonist approached and asked everyone to stop the strange movement and go to sleep. He called Jillian and Kara to talk with him in the tent. The mad dog thought he should at least cut the man's tongue out before leaving. The reason for calling everyone there was that they wanted to start counting the exact number of lanterns they had. Incredibly, they had already been counted, and there were 24. The protagonist noticed that a few were missing. Monsters had appeared behind them day and night in the forests. There hadn't been many in the last 2 nights. With that, he had a perspective that Belinda and the redhead wanted to hear. It seemed that the large man with white hair had already realized that if they entered the territory of night monster, things could go wrong. That was exactly what the protagonist was trying to say. If they were caught, it would be difficult. Inside the tent, he heard a sound that was bothering him. He looked toward the forest and knew they were now in the true beast forest. As night fell, the camp fell silent. Everyone was looking for a corner to sleep in. While the large Gordon slept, a lantern seemed to float near his neck. He seemed to be hearing something getting very close to his ears. The light from the lantern ended up waking the large man, who began listening to the sounds. His eyes, when they noticed the floating lantern, began to tremble. It was strange, so he jumped, never having seen a lantern float in front of him. He also felt when the monster was sniffing near his neck, as if it wanted to bite him. Everyone noticed when the large man started striking at the air out of nowhere. They looked at him, not understanding, as he grabbed a weapon and started swinging as if there was something there. The monster, which only he could see, screamed for him to get away immediately. Everyone approached and asked what was happening while he struck at the air. The large man, sweating, explained that he had seen a monster so close that it started to smell him. Those people began to question whether the big guy was really okay. No matter how much they looked around, they didn't notice anything, so they concluded that he was imagining it. When he looked back, he realized that whatever it was that had been close had disappeared. He tried to explain that he wasn't crazy, but everyone thought it was just a nightmare. Another person, a mercenary, approached them and said that the big man wasn't crazy. Indeed, the man with the eye patch and another with a scar had woken up and seen the floating lantern. Not just them, but several others had seen that manifestation happen near them. With that, the scared man concluded that it was no longer an illusion but a fact. Something was circling the camp, probably the night monster. The protagonist arrived and noticed that they had already understood the gravity of the situation. Everyone wanted to talk to him about what was happening, but he asked them to stay calm. He said they should gather as he would tell them everything that was going on. Everyone gathered outside the tent, while the protagonist and his closest allies were inside in a meeting. Gordon was one of those inside the tent with the leader, and upon hearing that there really was a monster, he was terrified. The scared guy also found it strange that he knew that, since even they hadn't seen it clearly. The protagonist, with a serious look, said that they had probably started following everyone once they got close to the lake. That was one of the monsters that ruled the beast forest during the night, called the Hunting Shadow. They could hide in the darkness, making them invisible, and physical attacks wouldn't work on them either. They were shocked when the leader said there were hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Belinda concluded that this was why the lanterns had been disappearing one after another. The redhead got upset, realized they were just toying with them, and left the tent to wipe them all out. However, the leader's order was different. He was to wait for them to attack first. Belinda stated an undeniable fact: the lanterns were disappearing. The protagonist warned that if they attacked now, it would immediately alert the enemy. The plan was to eliminate them all at once, so they would keep pretending not to have seen them. Jillian wanted to know if he truly intended to face thousands of invisible and deadly monsters at once, and the answer was yes. The protagonist explained that everyone outside had scrolls, and that he would explain how they were going to fight. He drew a few lines on the ground with his sword and said the polar group was focused on surrounding them. Drawing on the ground, he explained that they were few in number and had been stealing the lanterns, advancing one batch at a time. Continuing the drawings on the ground, he warned that the longer they waited, the more the monsters would gather. Now Gillian understood why they had built the camp with its back to the lake. The protagonist said they were at a disadvantage, but it wasn't the end, because they would be the ones to make the first move. Of course, everyone looked at him to understand what that initiative would be. He continued drawing on the ground and said that dividing the unit into 3 was the best strategy. The shield group would be made up of squires who would hold the enemy's charge. Then came the unit of archers who would delay the monsters. Finally, the assault unit would go all in, under his command, using every type of weapon. The drawings on the ground showed that the shield and archer units would stay at the center, blocking the enemy's advance. Meanwhile, the elite assault unit would target the weak point, which became clear through the drawings he was making. He pointed his sword at another drawing and said that would be their guarantee of victory. Everyone observed those sketches on the ground. The main thing was for the shield and archer units to endure as long as possible. Belinda asked everyone to calm down because she had something to say. She had a question. If the monsters couldn't be harmed with physical attacks, how were they going to defeat them? With that, the protagonist simply glanced sideways at her, while everyone waited for his response. He stared at the girl and said he had already figured it out. It would be with magic scrolls. This was all requested so that the whole group, while maintaining formation, would hold out until the leader broke it. The monsters had taken the last lantern, and now something was heading their way. The protagonist knew about the formation because it had been written in the newspaper he read in his past life, and he thought about that as he walked. While observing the scroll, he knew those monsters were weak against light. That's how, when a light source appeared, they would reveal their true forms, and with that, the protagonist would tear a piece of paper. Seeing that, they activated all the magic scrolls at once. They had to use that spell first. Yes, everyone was casting it. After the activation, those lights in the sky would attract everyone's attention. They would march with all reinforcements to the place indicated by the lights. Many of them would be affected by the brightness on the way and wouldn't even be able to get close. With that, the shield group noticed the darkness had vanished, and that their true forms were horrifying. However, they needed to be careful, because despite their bizarre appearance, they could be dangerous. The next team was the archers, who were already preparing their arrows toward the monsters. While protected by the shield bearers, the archers could prevent the monsters from getting close. Farther ahead, the group armed with various types of weapons was waiting. As soon as their true forms were revealed, the protagonist raised his sword, saying their time had come. With that, he was the first to get close enough to them all. He called for the elite assault unit to charge at once, and so they did. That command made everyone begin attacking the monsters that had now revealed their true forms. The protagonist showed all his skill sheet against those bestial beings. He noticed that they merged with the darkness, but when exposed, they proved to be weak. The order was to exterminate as many monsters as possible. He asked Gillian to attract their attention and block their attacks, while the mad dog attacked all of them, eliminating as many as possible. He avoided being cornered by those creatures, which in larger numbers could be dangerous. He relied on Belinda's backup, who as support would create multiple openings in the polar areas. Thus, the protagonist's plan was moving full steam ahead, everything going perfectly well. Belinda, the young lord shouted, and the reason was simple. A group of those monsters had grouped together and was heading toward him with all their force. The protagonist knew that this elite attack team should take care of as much as possible. The lighting increased, revealing everyone's true faces. Meanwhile, the shooters managed to reduce a large part of their numbers. The shield bearers prevented those monsters from attacking the following team. At some point, they were tired, unable to keep going, as they had been like this for hours. When they lowered their guard for a moment, the monsters tried to devour the shield bearer team. Before that could happen, the leader's sword crossed in front, and the entire elite team arrived just in time to prevent the tragedy. With that, the leader looked at them and praised their work for having endured so long. Everyone smiled widely when they saw that the young lord had appeared to save them. The order was to spread out, surrounding all the remaining monsters. They were not to let any escape. This was the time for the final counterattack. Thus, a herd of those monsters grouped together and tried to retreat. The protagonist realized they were fleeing, but found it strange that they began to retreat before being surrounded. He noticed that the polar teams could act quickly, so he asked Belinda to find their leader. He specified that it was the one with horns on his head, different from the others, as he was the one giving orders. However, he was asked if it wouldn't be better to let them flee, as they could return with a larger group. This time, they had the advantage of catching the enemies off guard. A second time, they wouldn't have a chance. Belinda, hearing the young lord's orders, realized he was right. She smiled as she noticed that he had completely changed from what he was before, a useless noble. Knowing this, she would obey the orders given and find the leader. She tied a rope to a tree with the intention of launching herself forward as fast as possible. Thus, she intended to find in the crowd the one with a different horn on his head. It wasn't difficult to identify him, as he had horns like those of a unicorn. Belinda threw her weapon in his direction. The intention was clear: to immobilize the leader so he couldn't give orders to the others anymore. While immobilizing him, she shouted to the young lord that she had found him and managed to pull him. Immediately, the protagonist charged in the direction indicated by Belinda, where the enemy leader was. He positioned himself firmly, ready to take as many of them down as he could along with the leader. Taking advantage of the path, he started destroying all the enemies, trying to get close to the leader to eliminate him. When he managed to knock the leader down, the others began to retreat, as if they didn't know what to do. The protagonist shouted that the leader was annihilated and that everyone should finish off the rest with relative ease. The shield-bearer group was now protected, as they had the strength and confidence in the leader to attack. The redhead also gave his orders and wanted all the mercenaries in his group to advance as soon as possible. They didn't want to lose to an old man, since Gillian was cleaning up wherever he went. The night took its time to pass, but finally, the day began showing signs of the sun's arrival. When time eliminated the last of that race, he praised everyone's work. He said that the victory came only because of unity and collaboration, with everyone doing their part in the plan. Proudly, they raised their weapons, showing that they were the best. Gordon was proud of his muscles and how much he had helped influencing the shield bearers. Belinda was still acting as a protector and wanted to know if the young lord was hurt. He asked Belinda to count how many were still there, as someone had disappeared. He asked them to burn the remains of those monsters so that the smell would prevent others from appearing. When the mad dog didn't know the reason, it was the old man who explained. Looking back, the protagonist saw the redhead starting to tease the old man, but knew that a great friendship would grow from that. He thought it had been 10 days since they entered that beast forest. According to the map, the polar teams had been eliminated, and the dangers on the route they had charted were over. All that was left was to reach the vein of the ruined stones. He looked at the horizon and saw the sun. The protagonist looked at everyone and realized that the journey was almost coming to an end. Belinda returned after counting the people. She reported that the servants were intact, but among the others, 3 had disappeared. The redhead, just to tease Gillian, announced that no one from his team had gone missing, since he was a competent leader. What was strange was that they found no evidence that the missing had been eliminated. However, among those who vanished, they noticed that the one who always talked about running away was not among them. Most likely, 2 fools had run off with him. It was obvious that they now ran the risk of being alone in the bestial forest. And that's exactly what had happened. The 3 were running, looking back and seeing that the battle seemed to be over. The man who caused the confusion kept shouting for everyone to run as fast as possible while the monsters were distracted. Looking back, the man was deeply frightened and almost fell. He was terrified to see the 2 in front of him trembling, yet he kept yelling that they weren't listening. One of them, shaking, pointed behind and asked him to look before speaking further. Huge eyes, as if a great creature was aiming to take them down all at once. It was a giant snake lying among the harmonic stones the protagonist had been trying to reach. It would catch its prey and place them in its nest, just as it did with those it captured. It threw the 3 into that nest to join the other skeletons. The gaze of that beast was deeply intense and displayed great savagery. Training in the camp continued alongside the protagonist, and the activities carried on as usual. They kept cutting down trees and clearing the path as they advanced. Everyone, including the protagonist, was equipped with tools to knock down as many trees as possible. The redhead observed those mercenaries and thought it was the first time he had seen them so disciplined. Big Gillian, seizing the moment, said they were different from a certain someone he knew. The redhead asked the protagonist if they would dismiss those mercenaries after the expedition, since he felt it would be a waste to abandon them. The protagonist explained that he planned to hire them as his soldiers, since common mercenaries didn't experience many battles. These ones were in perfect condition, their levels were appropriate, their physical strength too, and they were already disciplined. At that moment, someone approached, speaking with the redhead, reporting that the assigned tasks had been completed. He looked at the protagonist and said the scent effect was working well, as no other animals had approached. He looked ahead and said it seemed like nothing else would appear in their path. The protagonist looked forward, hoping everything was going according to plan, but he didn't believe it would be that easy. From above came Belinda, who had scouted the areas ahead. As she descended, the protagonist asked if she had seen anything. She answered, terrified, that she had. Watching her face as she spoke, he realized she was extremely agitated. Noticing that unusual reaction from his longtime servant, He ordered everyone to clear the path as quickly as possible. He shouted that their destination lay ahead, which made everyone marvel. The protagonist and his 3 closest members were overjoyed when they finally found what they had been searching for. The others thought it was impossible to be seeing so many runestones before them. The protagonist remained calm. This was the final destination of the expedition, or so he believed. The great vein of runestones was something he had read about in a newspaper from his past life. The redhead couldn't believe something so valuable was in the middle of that bestial forest. With that, the old man said the protagonist always had something up his sleeve. While the smiling Belinda hugged him, everyone stared at the pile of stones in awe, eager to rush in and grab them. However, the order that came through the dust was the opposite. Someone said no one would leave that place. The protagonist looked closely and saw a silhouette amidst the mist. It was one of the mercenaries who had gone missing. His appearance was strange, and he said it would be the end of them all. The mercenary was known as Manus and now was acting strangely. The other mercenaries didn't understand why that man was there, since he had gone ahead and pretended to vanish. When everyone tried to approach, they noticed the protagonist had infused mana into his sword. He ordered everyone to step back, as there was a danger they hadn't noticed. The protagonist, always on high alert, immediately sensed something was wrong. He swung his sword to disperse the mist, revealing what was hidden underneath. With that, everyone saw piles of monster skulls and other skeletons. They realized there were so many bones that it was hard to even see the ground. There were also some human remains. With that, everyone was to stay on high alert, as the protagonist believed they wouldn't be able to mine in peace. He also noticed that a toxic gas was emanating from the bodies and mixing into the atmosphere. The problem was that the protagonist noticed there was nothing about it in the journal. He asked everyone to pay attention and prepare for the fight. When he said this, a gigantic snake appeared right in front of him. It was enormous and opened its mouth as wide as it could. The protagonist gripped his sword tightly and warned everyone to shoot as quickly as possible. At first, everyone was frightened by the size of the reptile, but they needed to follow the order immediately. As the protagonist charged to attack the large serpent, he relied on his agility to dodge. He circled around the huge creature, looking for a weak spot to strike. He thought that if he attacked directly at its skull, it might have a greater effect. But when he tried to pierce it, he noticed that even using mana, he couldn't even scratch it. This was also noticed by Gillian and the redhead, who were watching the fight from below. The problem was that the enormous serpent's scales were as hard as steel. From its mouth came a large amount of venom, which it shot toward the protagonist. Luckily, he noticed it would hit him and dodged. Only his cloak was hit. However, the snake was going to attack with the tip of its tail. He quickly noticed the movement. He braced himself, as he was always on high alert, but almost got hit. The great reptile was very fast and realized when the tail was coming toward him again. The reptile seemed satisfied, thinking it had landed its strike. The young Belinda also believed this, shouting for her young master. The mercenaries began waving their weapons toward the giant serpent to try and move it. However, everyone had to be very careful, as that giant snake could throw them far away. Seeing the mercenaries somewhat paralyzed, Gillian had to intervene. He grabbed some who were about to be massacred and ran with them. Meanwhile, Belinda pulled others with her whip-like weapons. The Cerberus leader also reacted in the best way possible to defend his mercenaries. Shouts for help came from all directions. Everyone wanted to know if the lord had been attacked by the snake. They didn't know that he was in a practically safe spot, as she hadn't managed to eliminate him. Seeing this with their own eyes, there was no more doubt. That creature was the mistress of the vein of runic stones. The great reddish python was the master of that place. It was one of the monsters marked as impossible to hunt in that expedition. It was a surprise it was deeper in the forest. The chance of winning there was almost null. Retreating and waiting for an opportunity would be more valid. However, he decided he wouldn't waste time. He needed those stones, and holding one, he made a decision. If he gave up at that moment, everything he had gone through would have been in vain. He decided he would put an end to that snake and activated his mana flow. After opening the third core, he intended to confront the great serpent. It was between his fate and surrendering to failure, something unthinkable for him. Even in front of that horrendous beast, which attempted several times to attack him, he didn't regret striking. He attacked even knowing he wouldn't easily pierce its scales. When he used the third core, he realized he could scratch the surface of its scales. With that, he inflicted a large wound. He couldn't lower his guard for even a moment, as he noticed she was going to strike him with her tail. He noticed the movement in time to protect himself with his sword. All the weight she inflicted on him was very heavy, but he tried to protect himself as best he could. Seeing that she had managed to hold him with her tail, she now tried to bite him with her fangs. After he hit one of her eyes, she became furious and tried to attack in any way. He knew that, whatever happened, there were battles that couldn't be avoided. He remembered his father with all the responsibility on his shoulders, and that gave him strength. He also remembered all those who were counting on him, and he believed that with determination he could succeed. This was the right moment to fulfill his role as the one who would lead them all. Therefore, he launched himself at the snake, not caring about exhausting his body by using the third core. He looked at that giant snake, with its enormous body and reddish scales. No matter how much he looked, he couldn't see any serious injury coming from her direction. He thought that keeping the third core open for too long would put him at risk. If he continued like this, his mana would run out before he could eliminate the beast. He noticed that everyone had shown up to help at the right moment. Belinda looked at him, asking if he was okay and if he had gotten hurt, while the other two positioned themselves in front. She begged him to protect himself, as they would hold the creature for as long as possible. He insisted that everyone leave as it was too risky, and that he could handle it himself. Belinda couldn't believe what she was hearing, and even the mercenaries couldn't believe he would handle it alone. Jillian looked at him seriously and asked why he was doing that. He replied that not even he could guarantee their safety against a monster of that species. He warned that he couldn't risk losing all of them. Even so, Belinda didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay and help. She looked at him and thought that getting this far had been an incredible miracle. She couldn't understand why he insisted on continuing. Still, he didn't seem to change his mind, holding his sword in a commanding way. At that moment, the enormous snake spewed a large amount of its venom. He grew furious and ordered everyone to leave that place immediately. With an extremely serious tone in his voice, everyone began to run, to protect themselves and the young lord from the venom the serpent was releasing over them. Now he had to come up with another strategy, because he realized they wouldn't retreat. But when the mercenaries shouted that they would fight alongside the young lord, they began to see him as an equal and knew that their survival was thanks to him. The redhead, resting his large sword on his shoulder, said that if they managed to kill the monster, everything there would be theirs. Belinda also said she would never leave the young lord behind, and that Gillian would create a distraction to open a gap. They wanted him to believe in them, just as they believed in the young lord's potential. Against that argument, there was nothing he could say. He just looked at everyone and explained that the serpent was abnormally large. He made them reflect on the fact that its venom was deadly and that its reddish scales couldn't be pierced. He told everyone that if the snake landed even one attack, they would die instantly. But even so, Belinda didn't back down. He, staring at the giant serpent, said he would bring it down and strike its other eye. Then he raised his sword and called everyone from the Beast Forest expedition to eliminate the monster together and return home. That gave all the mercenaries renewed courage, and now they had a real reason to fight. Even though he went ahead to face a giant, furious, reddish snake, none of them would retreat. The protagonist, along with his three main members, moved with the intention to attack and find a weak point. The redhead, using his strength, managed to pierce one of the great python's eyes. After that blow, it became extremely enraged and began to swing its tail frantically. Jillian also landed a strike, driving his axe into the area where it twisted. Meanwhile, the protagonist launched himself to deliver another blow he had planned to be fatal. As soon as he managed to pierce it with his sword, the great python, despite knowing the future, felt that everything was unfolding according to plan, but now real fighters stood beside him. If he didn't act, everyone would perish, so he joined them, and they all attacked the giant serpent at once. He wasn't willing to let anyone face such great risk, so he charged at it while the third core was still open. He was the only one who knew the future of that place, so he couldn't allow all that wealth to fall into others' hands. Determined, he threw himself into the mouth of the great python. Doing so shocked and terrified everyone watching, who thought the serpent had devoured him. That was part of his plan, which consisted of striking the snake from the inside out, and the plan was working. They could see his sword piercing through the serpent, and then he emerged covered in the beast's venom. The three main allies could hardly believe he had performed such a dangerous maneuver. Ghislaine knew he was the future of Pertium and wouldn't give up. He intended to claim many of those runestones. Meanwhile, at the castle, Ven slammed his hand hard on the table, thinking a betrayal had occurred. Someone had ignored the Lord's orders and decided to enter the dangerous forest. No matter how much Albert thought about it, he couldn't understand the young Lord's actions, which seemed irrational. But the steward said there was no point in speculating, as the young lord had already been in the forest for more than 15 days. Now the commander of the troops who had helped him, along with the soldier Ricardo, were imprisoned for treason. Meanwhile, the lord listened to all that discussion during the meeting and remained silent. He seemed deeply worried about his son's actions. The captain of the knights said it was urgent and that they needed to accompany him. The count wanted to know what was happening with Ronald, and they informed him that the young Ghislaine, after going through so much in that bestial forest, was returning, now victorious. Upon arriving, he met with the key members who were at the castle at that moment. He couldn't avoid the intense and suspicious stares, because just like the three, his father was also watching. Now the young lord was supposed to explain everything. but he only told his father that he had recently returned. The Count was certain he had blocked his son's access to the Beast Forest. Ghislaine apologized but insisted it had been an extremely necessary measure for the greater good. Everyone present at the meeting believed that nothing could justify such a need and couldn't understand. The captain of the knights explained that entering the Beast Forest was considered an unforgivable crime. However, the young man explained that, as everyone could see, he was alive and the monsters hadn't attacked. No one there believed that the young man was lying or using words just to justify himself. Even so, Albert asked if he had found the trip to the forest interesting or dangerous. He answered that there had been no incidents during the trip, so he didn't see any major problems, but there was something that couldn't be ignored, and he then pulled the paper from his pocket. Upon grabbing it to read, he noticed it was a letter from Count Rayfold reporting everything he had done. It also mentioned that he had taken a large amount of money from Miss Amelia by threatening her. Ronald said that because of that, the Count of that region would cut off the aid they had been receiving. The protagonist read and saw that it was a statement written directly by Count Rayfold, who didn't like her. He knew taking her money hadn't been difficult, but seeing that she had allied with the enemy was shocking. He placed his hand over the letter, thinking that Amelia knew things weren't over when she sent assassins. However, he realized time wasn't on his side and that he needed to act cautiously and quickly. Ronald asked if he had anything else to say to the group who waited attentively. The old man with white hair and mustache said he would have to return the money he had taken. The captain of the knights was displeased, as that amount was enough to cover the order's expenses. The young man explained that he had spent all the money, leaving everyone in the room perplexed and silent. He said he used it all for the expedition to the Beast Forest so that it would be a success. Ronald couldn't believe he had spent all the money on a single dangerous expedition. The young man apologized, saying he had no other option and wouldn't have done anything differently. At the very least, he hoped the captain of the knights would understand his situation during that difficult time. Suddenly, the captain grabbed him by the collar and said he had been far too reckless. He accused the heir to the throne of trying to destroy his own territory with his poor decisions. The white-haired man pointed a finger at him and said he had lost his place in society. The young man asked everyone to stay calm and promised he would personally repay all the necessary money. He said he would pay off the debt in full, which made his father curious to know how. The young man called Belinda and asked her to enter the room with a small box. The young woman came in carrying a small box that instantly drew the attention of everyone present. Ghislaine stood up and commented that if he only wanted to go to the forest, he wouldn't have spent it all. When the young woman opened the box, everyone was dazzled by the intense shine of the blue stones inside. The protagonist explained that he had gone to find high-grade rune stones and that the box was full of them. Now everyone was amazed to see such unexpectedly valuable, top-quality stones. It was the same old man who wanted to expel and treat the heir like a criminal who now admired the stones. He didn't even mention that he had mined those stones in the forest, proving that his expedition had been truly productive. Ronald held the stones in his hands and said that if they were unique, the value still wouldn't be enough. The young man said those wouldn't be enough alone, but the rest would cover the full debt. With that, he explained that the camp had been mining day and night, gathering valuable resources. They also had the bodies of monsters slain during the mining process in the forest. Everyone at the meeting, along with the Lord, could now see everything the young man had accomplished in the past 15 days. The old man with white hair couldn't believe the young man had done all that in such a short time. The Lord wanted to know from Belinda if all it had been acquired in a single expedition, and she confirmed. She said they had to face enormous monsters to reach the stones, and that what she showed was only a fraction. The young man said he had spent so much to help his land, and that everything would be used for the state. He spoke softly with the Lord, estimating that the amount would be enough to pay off all outstanding debt. Everyone watched that young man who, to some extent, had become their savior and beacon of hope. Those who previously shouted at him were now patting his shoulders, full of respect and admiration. He received praise and was asked if he was exhausted after the arduous and dangerous expedition. Even the captain of the knights, once harsh and rude, was now overflowing with praise and admiration. The young lord's first demand was that the commander of the troops be released, along with the soldier Ricardo. Secondly, they would continue to restrict access to the Beast Forest to prevent dangerous rumors. They couldn't allow unnecessary gossip to spread, as it would cause serious problems for the state. Lastly, he himself would recruit and manage the mercenary forces and Pertium's security. Even after his accomplishments, they found it difficult to leave him in command of a personal and powerful army. They weren't sure if that young lord wasn't making serious mistakes with such risky decisions. Instead of asking for forgiveness for his errors, he was trying to manipulate the situation to keep their support. However, he admitted that Albert was wrong and said he was only setting conditions to maintain support. If anything were even slightly interfered with, they would suffer financially, and they couldn't afford that. Despite Ronald asking his brother to intervene, he merely observed while his son bargained. His Roop showed up calling him boss, wanting to know the next orders for the mission. Now everyone was gathered and noticed he was in the middle of an important negotiation. Jillian reported that the transport of the runestones was nearly complete and awaiting orders. The redhead also spoke of the completed tasks, informing that the trees had been successfully removed. He asked what they planned to do with the giant python captured during the difficult expedition. He was informed that the python would be dismantled, with the venom and other parts properly stored. His father, seeing all of his son's progress, called Ronald over and remarked that the mercenaries' presence was remarkable. They were recording from afar and still couldn't understand how the young lord emanated so much power and control. The count looked at his son, realizing he was a great negotiator with a promising future. He noted that they formed an elite unit and asked if they were truly such a specialized force. He went on to say that making rebellious mercenaries follow orders was something that should be recognized and valued by everyone. The protagonist didn't want his father to speak of the mercenaries that way, as they were essential. If it weren't for them, the expedition would never have been a success and everything would have failed. The count said he had seen everything he needed and called everyone to return to the castle. To his son, he said that this time he would let it go, but he wouldn't tolerate further mistakes or disobedience. Ghislaine knew this was his father's subtle way of congratulating him without drawing attention. The protagonist knew that one day he would inherit that entire place and become a great leader. The Lord said he would one day hold the title of Northern Wolf Spirit, a special honor. He knew that title was given to the Count of Pertium, who defended the kingdom of Lucania with courage. Despite that, his father was only one man, with weak military power and a ruined state. Even so, he managed to keep fighting non-stop, defending everything at the cost of his own life. He knew his father had a tragic and miserable death that no one would even remember. The mercenaries were tired and thought it was finally time to rest a bit after everything. However, the protagonist said it wasn't time to relax and asked them to prepare everything. They had to leave as soon as possible to ensure progress continued and objectives were met. Even Gillian thought the young man had pushed himself too far and urgently needed rest. Even so, Belinda said it had been difficult to detoxify his body from all the poison absorbed. The protagonist simply placed a hand on her shoulder and asked her to keep believing in him. He looked deeply into her eyes and said he would always count on her, as he always had. In that way, he convinced the three main members to remain by his side, firm and confident in his leadership. He knew that news of the runestones would spread very quickly across the kingdom. That's why they had to prepare as soon as possible. Even though he was already very tired, he thought that once they reached a level where no one would dare challenge them, then they could finally rest. His body was exhausted, and after a few steps, he collapsed to the ground, unable to go on.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.